This story apparently begins in a dungeon. Inside it, a boy was lying on the ground, covered in blood. He seemed frustrated with something, asking how that old man had done that to him, because that was not how he was supposed to die. He decided he wouldn't die like trash. His name was Ju Hyun, and he was 38 years old, but that didn't matter because the boy thought he would die that day. And if he were to think about where everything started to go wrong, he would probably have to go back 15 years in time. In the year 2025, tomes began to appear all over the world, causing earthquakes as they emerged. Inside them were extremely rare objects called relics. These relics were responsible for significant changes in the world. Just like in legends, they possessed immense power, and the ones that appeared in the present world were no different. Their abilities varied in surprising ways, and this caused the story of how people's lives changed to spread worldwide. Many people began to dedicate their lives to searching for these relics, and the protagonist was no exception. During this search, he found something incredible, an arcane relic capable of providing him with knowledge about tombs and other important information about relics. With this item, the boy saw an opportunity to change his life and start a new path as a great relic user. Sometime later, a new law spread worldwide, and those who possessed relics began to monopolize them, creating a society that limited the use of these precious items. The protagonist's only option was to work for these people. Due to his exceptional excavation skills, he was hired by a large company called TKBM. However, the work was extremely difficult and often got his hands dirty. As a tomb raider, he honed his skills, managing to enter restricted areas to acquire relics that others have found. The assault group he led achieved impressive results. Years later, the company's CEO became the most powerful relic user in the world. However, the more that man gained notoriety, the more the protagonist and his companions were despised. Even so, he continued to work hard, but he never expected it all to end that way. The mission he was on at that moment had been a trap created by the CEO himself, who sent him and his companions on a suicide mission. The CEO did this because he felt threatened by the protagonist's exceptional skills. Back in the present, the boy seems to be fighting a giant snake. He asks if the creature wasn't satisfied after devouring all his friends and challenges it to attack him, promising that even if he died and became a ghost, he would do everything to end that man's life. Suddenly, a voice says he was really very noisy. Irritated, the protagonist asks what the voice had said. Surprised, the voice asks if he could hear it. The young man in turn replies that he didn't know which god that voice belonged to, but since it was talking to him, it should help him get rid of the creature and get out of there. However, the voice explains that it wouldn't be that easy and asks if he really believed he could survive with his body in that condition. The voice continues, saying that the boy's body was halfway gone and that no matter how hard he fought to survive, it wouldn't do any good because this was the miserable end of his life. Still, the voice acknowledges that the boy had exceptional talent but laments that he started too late, preventing him from enjoying his full power. Irritated, the protagonist tells the voice to stop talking as if it knew him and asks if it really believed he wanted to live that way. He promises that he will do everything to kill the person who betrayed him. Then the voice says it would really be a waste to see the boy die with so much talent, so it will give him a chance to live again. Suddenly, a bird appears before the boy, and the voice says it will watch to see if he will be able to claim the throne in this new life. At that moment, the protagonist opens his eyes. Sitting in a chair, he realizes he's in a completely different place. Surprised, he notices that both his legs are back and his body is completely healed. He wonders what happened. Meanwhile, a group of people is talking. Irritated, the boy asks to get it over with, and the other man says he had already given up because the year 2025 was known as the year when no one would go home. Surprised, our boy thinks they weren't in 2025. But when he looks at the calendar, he sees the date is correct and wonders what is happening. Observing a young man, the boy thinks he looked familiar, remembering a kid who later went to fight him, thus entering into a fight and going straight to the police station. Surprised, the protagonist questions if that was real and if he had really gone back in time. Remembering the words of that voice, the boy is surprised. He assumes that in the year 2025, the world was still at peace because at that time, the relics had not yet appeared. So there should be some time until the divine rank relics show up. If that were the case, from that day on, the protagonist would be able to collect all the relics. His knowledge, along with his memories, was intact, so he should start grabbing all the relics in the world. He mentioned that this was getting very exciting. After the world went mad because of the relics, Ju Hyun believed that nothing could surprise him. To begin with, he never believed there was a tomb that could make even a digger like him tremble with fear. Secondly, being sent on that mission was a trap set by that CEO from before. And lastly, right after dying, the boy suddenly returned to 15 years ago. It seemed like a second chance to rebuild his future, so he could grab the relics before anyone else. Next, an elderly woman asks if the boy was listening, mentioning that he was completely distracted and didn't even pay attention to the police officers because he had hit her son, who was still in school. So if he caused any trauma to him, you should take responsibility. Therefore, you should pay compensation in money or go to jail. The protagonist thinks she was very annoying and that he should deal with her first. Even though it was 15 years ago, the boy remembered as if it was yesterday that boy who won to fight with the protagonist. The boy didn't want to leave Ju-hyun alone, so Ju-hyun hit him, but he must have planned it from the start since he barely touched him and the boy was already on the ground. As a result, he ended up having to apologize and beg them to lower the amount of money to be paid, because his current self didn't have any money at all. Besides, his tools and his relics were not there yet, so he should hurry to collect them. Meanwhile, that elderly woman was still irritated, asking how the young man dared to ignore her. About to slap the boy, she says he should pay attention. At that moment, the protagonist grabs the woman's hand, thinking that the move was involuntary due to his experience and battle knowledge. Immediately after, the boy asks the woman to calm down, saying that it was her son who started the fight and asking if she didn't think they were being ridiculous. Irritated, the other boy lunges at Ju-hyun, who easily dodges. In a matter of seconds, he immobilizes the young man on the ground. Thinking that his body felt lighter than before, assuming it was because he hadn't yet experienced the side effects after using the relics. Right after that, a group of police officers arrives to interfere in the situation, asking what the reason for the mess was. Then Ju-hyun says he had no money to give them and asks to be allowed to go home. The woman in turn asks if the boy was crazy because he preferred to have a criminal record than make a deal with them. However, for the protagonist that didn't matter, because when the relics appear, the world will become a chaotic land without any law. So it would be better to fight, but even so, it still wouldn't be enough, and because of that, he should find some source of income to pay for his excavations. Wondering what he should do, looking around, he notices a floating bar with his name on it and wonders what it was. Supposing he might be going crazy, the boy was starting to see things. And the relics were one of the only things that could make that happen, so it could be the work of that crow from before. Starting to shout, he asks if, by any chance, he was being watched. At that moment, several screens appear before the boy. The system informs him that Ju-hyun had a spying ability that allowed him to observe around within a meter radius. Surprised, the boy wonders if that was a skill window similar to a game's, asking if that voice from before thought his life was some kind of game. At that moment, the system informs him that there is a new mission, and that he must recover the 4 basic assault skills from the functions. Then a man appears, asking what was going on and telling the boy to keep quiet. Surprised, Ju-hyun realizes that only he could see those windows. Also, he could see anything within a meter radius, and that ability was the same as one of his relics. Wondering if by chance, all of his previous abilities also ended up that way, because if that were the case, it wouldn't make sense to go after his relics again. Questioning what that voice was planning because relics usually like to help people. Next, a man calls the protagonist. Sometime later, Ju-hyun was already out of that cell. His friend says it shouldn't have been him who went to jail, but either way, he would take care of that incident, so he shouldn't worry. The name of that man was Kim Jong-woo, who was practically a brother who took care of the boy when he was an orphan, treating him as if he were real family. Mentioning that he didn't remember him being so young 15 years ago. Then the protagonist says he had something to ask the man, asking if there had been any reports of paranormal activities or anything like that. The man then asks if the boy was drunk, remembering that in fact his wife had said she had some supernatural powers to find his secret hideout. Then Ju-hyun thinks that the relics really hadn't appeared yet. Next, Kim says the protagonist should go home and rest. Ju-hyun thinks that even though the tombs were already appearing in various places, they still hadn't caused any significant problems since their users didn't exist yet. In other words, that was the perfect moment to start acting, as he could use his skills to have a great chance of achieving his goals. The only problem was that the boy had no money, and in the beginning the relics started to appear somewhere in Europe or America, wondering how he could pay for his trip to those places. Then a group of people appears, asking why the protagonist was walking around that place instead of working. Observing the group, our boy seems to recognize them. The man asks if the protagonist had any sense of respect because Ju-hyun should have been bowing immediately. The name of that jerk was Park Kyung-tae. He was originally a street thief, but now he worked as an art specialist, working alongside his older sister Park Kyung, and the two took care of an art gallery. When the protagonist was in school and needed money quickly, he ended up working for them for a while because he was planning to work and then leave shortly after. But those bastards didn't let him go so easily. But it wasn't like it was useless because he did his job like everyone else and he didn't receive the same treatment. Thus, they kept a leash on his neck, threatening him with money and treating him like an animal. Irritated, the man asks why he wasn't responding and if he needed a beating. At that moment, our protagonist punches the man in the face. The group around is surprised by what Ju-hyun had done, and the boy tells them to tell their boss that he was tired of working for her. Additionally, he wanted to receive his overdue salary and compensation. Laughing at the boy, the man says he's seen it all when you've lived long enough, lunging at the boy. But at the same moment, the protagonist lands a punch on the man. Surprised, the group asks what had happened because Ju-hyun had become so fast. They begin to attack the protagonist all at once, but it has no effect because within seconds, 2 of them are already on the ground. Ju-hyun asks if they were finished because he felt sorry for them as the world would only get more difficult from now on. Ju-hyun thinks he's glad his body could move as before because he wasn't strong enough yet to endure those attacks and had to end it. The other man in turn says they had taken in the boy and raised him as if he were theirs, but that's how the boy was repaying them. The other guy says they should be careful when using that knife because it would be used as an exchange. Surprised, the protagonist realizes that knife was none other than a relic, wondering why that bastard had one. But it wasn't that surprising because most relics create giant tombs to attract more people, but some prefer to hide among human society. Meanwhile, that man charges at the boy, who easily manages to immobilize the man, saying he had the guts to point a knife like that at him, so he would take good care of it for them. Looking at the knife, he tells the group to look and learn because that's how you use a real knife. Looking at the group, the boy realizes what the real ability of that knife was. About to attack the protagonist, the two are surprised because he had disappeared. At that moment, the two end up receiving an attack. Surprised, the boy thinks that knife also had the power of possession, telling the two to stop whining because that cut wasn't even deep. But if they still refused to give their money, things would get much worse, ordering them to hand it over if they didn't want to die. Desperate, the group agrees to do as the protagonist said. Sometime later, we cut to a city at night. Irritated, a woman is surprised because Ju Hyun had beaten up her henchman and demanded the money. But the other man says he also didn't know what was happening, as until yesterday that bastard didn't know anything about fighting. But now he had completely changed, and even his eyes gave off a sense of danger. Disappointed, the woman asks how much they ended up losing. Then the man says he lost all the money in his account and the product that was supposed to be used in that exchange. Irritated, the woman asks if they had lost that Buddha statue, and the man says he had told her that the money was very little. So the woman orders them to recover that statue. Sometime later, the protagonist seems to be trying to sell that statue, but the seller says it was likely worth almost nothing, and that maybe it would be better to use it as decoration in his house. And that's why, just by looking at it, he could tell that no one would buy it. Ju Hyun thinks that's very strange because that man was acting like it was worth millions, but in the end, it was just trash. While walking down the street, the boy thinks he felt like it was something valuable, assuming he had judged wrong because at that moment he still didn't have his arcane relic. At that moment, observing that statue, he notices a purple aura coming out of it. Right after, a system screen appears. The system informs him that the spying ability has been activated and has detected a suspicious essence coming from that statue. Surprised, Ju Hyun assumes there is something inside that statue, mentioning that he already knew that and that there was no way that man would go crazy over such a cheap statue. Taking out his dagger, he says he should see what's inside that statue. Cutting it into pieces, inside it was a kind of jar, thinking it looked like liquid drugs and that usually some drops of this are put on cigarettes, which is why people smoke them. Then he remembers they had several of those, questioning if there were drugs inside them. Right after, Ju Hyun seems to make a call to someone, asking if the reward for reporting drug trafficking was a substantial amount. Meanwhile, that woman from before seems to be on a call with someone, saying she guarantees it wasn't because the goods weren't ready, as she was only advising to stay alert for a while, apologizing for what happened and saying she would contact him again soon. Ending the call, the woman is completely irritated, questioning why she should give all the money to him. Right after, that group from before appears, and the woman asks if they managed to recover that statue. But the guy says they were discovered, so they were screwed. Nervous, the woman questions what was happening. Then the other man says they received a report that they were not only smuggling drugs but also distributing them. But the woman says her business was only in artworks, so they were ordinary people. Irritated, the man says that criminals like them always said the same thing, which is why they brought some evidence. And they knew that this wasn't everything they had, questioning if they had more warehouses like those. Irritated, the woman wonders if they also knew about that warehouse from before, but it was okay because they had expenses and all of them had passwords. Mentioning she had no idea what they were talking about and that if they didn't have any proof, they should leave that place. Just because they were police officers didn't mean they had the right to interfere in other people's business. Right after, the man picks up a walkie-talkie saying that the 600 pieces of artwork were found and inside them all had drugs. Surprised, the woman asks if they had opened all the warehouses because that was impossible, as all of them had passwords. The man says that's right, and that's why they had their ways of bypassing all that, because it was good to have someone on the inside helping them. Meanwhile, a man tells the protagonist that it seemed there were some warehouses that hadn't been opened yet, mentioning he was very impressed that the protagonist managed to open all of them. Then Ju Hyun says he had a good memory, and the truth was that his memory was exceptional, and it could be said that it was one of his few talents. And that was why that woman wanted to use him later, because when he worked, he had difficulties the first time as all the warehouses had different passwords. At that time, he didn't find it suspicious, but it became annoying, so he memorized all of them. That's why he never imagined it would be so useful now in the present and everything was going as planned. And he would also receive his cash reward, which meant he would finally have at least some money to collect the relics soon. Surprised, the other officer says there were even more drugs there, and that those bastards were quite greedy, saying the protagonist had done a good job. Shortly after, Ju Hyun asks if he could request a favor. While they were taking that woman to prison, that man receives a call, asking why Ju Hyun wanted to speak with him. Then the officer asks the woman to wait a moment, mentioning that his assistant wanted to speak with her. On the call, the protagonist says she should have treated him better because when he worked, he should have been paid. Recognizing that voice, the woman asks if it was the protagonist who did this. Ju-hyun then says she should change the passwords every 6 months or something like that. But anyway, that didn't matter anymore, so she should enjoy her time in jail. Irritated, the woman says she will kill Ju-hyun someday. Sometime later, the protagonist is walking down the street, saying that was very relaxing. Right after, someone sends a message to the boy. A man says he was very proud of the boy and that soon he would receive a big reward, so he shouldn't spend it all on nonsense. Happy, the young man thinks that man was always worried about him. But there was no need to worry because he got his starting capital, and now he could start looking for the relics along with the tombs. And so he would find them before that CEO from before. Looking at something, the boy seems surprised, realizing that his house was completely buried. The apartment where Ju-hyun lived was completely covered by a giant tomb, and that tomb was definitely created by a relic. The residents in the midst of that commotion are asking what was happening, and a huge argument starts. Meanwhile, the protagonist among them thinks that wasn't surprising because it was quite normal and everyone was in a total panic. Relics and tomes have enormous powers, and because of that, they cause tremendous chaos. But stopping to think, he remembers receiving a call from his roommate back then, saying that the apartment had disappeared and asking what the boy would do. At that moment, Ju-hyun didn't know what was happening because he was still being enslaved by those people. And when he finished his work and returned home, everything was completely normal. If that was the case, it meant that someone had managed to defeat the two before. And this meant that whoever was responsible for that should be nearby, so he shouldn't lose sight of that person along with their relic. Meanwhile, the boy hears someone begging not to shoot. Observing the man, he realizes it was his roommate. Irritated, the soldier asks if he was joking because he should stop asking so many questions and return to where he was. Within seconds, Ju-hyun appears, kicking that soldier, asking how he could point a gun at a civilian, mentioning that it had been a long time since he saw his friend and that he hadn't changed at all. As the soldier gets up, the protagonist asks if the man had thought carefully about what he had done, apologizing because he had lost his temper. Irritated, the protagonist demands an explanation for what was happening, questioning why the army was there, asking if they were trying to enter that tomb, but the man says that was classified information. Ju-hyun thinks he needed to know the reason for this because, as far as he knew, the government could be his rival, wondering if the country already knew about the existence of those tombs. The boy says that since he lived there, he had the right to know what was happening, questioning why the whole army was there and on top of that armed, mentioning that the soldier didn't know what was happening and was making a mistake, so he should stop making things worse than they already were, and that's why he just wanted to know the reason. Then the soldier says they were trying to blow that thing up and dig out what was inside, so there was no need to worry about being in danger. In addition, they even brought in foreign specialists, so they assured everything was fine. Understanding everything, Ju-hyun thanks him for telling, mentioning that now he felt safer, asking everyone to continue with their work there and in addition to be careful. Shortly after, the protagonist's roommate appears, asking what he had talked about with the soldier, but the boy tells him to do nothing and remain standing there. Seeing Ju-hyun leave, his friend thinks he was acting a bit strange that day. Nearby, a woman asks if he was sure the Korean government still knew nothing about those tombs, and that person says he was sure, questioning why she kept asking. Then the woman says that the immense number of soldiers didn't make sense, but the man says it was probably because they wanted to do their best to help, and either way, they should avoid asking that in public, as there were people who understood. Asking how the mission was going, the woman mentions that the explosives would be added soon. Then the man asks her to ensure that everything continues until the end and that she should investigate the tomb carefully and, if possible, recover the relic. Shortly after, a man appears, questioning why she was surprised as it was more normal for him to be in that place than for her. He mentions they were from a neighboring country, so it made sense. He also mentions that her group was quite devoted to continuing their missions of stealing relics. However, the woman says they were simply recovering relics to be handed over to the International Police Association, and their mission was focused on maintaining peace and conducting safe experiments on those pieces. Then the man says that if they were following that rule, it meant they could also use them safely. The woman asks why they should trust him, but the man says it doesn't matter because they were doing the same thing at that exact moment. Meanwhile, Ju-hyun was watching the two arguing, thinking that now he would go ahead. Looking down, he seems to find what he was looking for, mentioning that those runes were called tomb glyphs. Those relics were funny entities that liked to present themselves in that way and expected to be noticed by the world. It was as if they thought they were main characters in a fantasy world, and if he could decipher those glyphs, they would indicate where the entrance to the tomb was and what kind of traps would be inside. Therefore, it should be considered a trap since most people cannot decipher them correctly. However, the protagonist easily manages to decipher them, thus discovering where the entrance to that place was. At that moment, a system screen appears, mentioning that he had discovered a new title and a new skill, awakening a basic tomb raiding skill. Another skill appears in his status bar, the ability to understand all languages. The boy says that was great, but he didn't like those windows popping up in his face because he couldn't see anything. While thinking that now he just needed to unlock his skills, a man watched the protagonist punching the air, wondering if that boy was crazy. Sometime later, Ju-hyun was still looking for those marks around the city. Finding one, the boy says it was right there. and so now it was time to enter that tomb. And at that moment, a light emanates throughout the city. The system alerts that a massive aura has been detected coming in his direction, and shortly after, the ground starts to crack. Seeing that beam of light in the sky, a group of people wonders what that was, and another man says it seemed like the entrance to the tomb had just been opened. Within seconds, that man from before starts walking toward that place, ordering the soldiers not to leave there, because a second explosion could happen, so they needed to ensure no civilians got close. Sometime later, the two arrive at the place of that beam of light. However, it was too bright there, and no one could see the bottom. Throwing a rock, the woman says it seemed like there was water down there. The other man says if that was the case, he would jump first. Meanwhile, the protagonist was below that place, saying those idiots were coming after him. But he would make it a bit harder for them, mentioning it was time to activate his trap. Shortly after, that man reaches the tomb. The woman says he didn't even think before acting, and that's why he was so dumb. Looking around, the woman asks what that was, and the man says it looked like something was approaching. At that moment, inside that tomb, water starts to pour out, drowning the two without mercy. Meanwhile, the protagonist seems to find what he was looking for. Next to him, a very bright lake appears, assuming he only had that dagger with him but should use it anyway. Throwing the dagger into that well, a giant snake emerges as a consequence, asking which person had dropped their belonging, ordering a response immediately because it had with it a golden dagger and a silver one, and asked which one belonged to him. Ju-heen in turn says that was an easy question, mentioning that the relics of that tomb were called the gold and silver axes, and that snake was based on a very famous urban legend. That legend was also known in other countries, so even foreigners would easily pass that test. However, it was already too late because that relic belonged to the protagonist, who responded that neither of the daggers was his. Hearing what the protagonist had said, the snake is surprised. Showing a new dagger, it asks if that was his, to which he responds that it really was his dagger. If he answered in that way, he would receive his weapon along with the gold and silver axes. However, the boy seemed to be planning something more, asking if he could see if it was really his dagger. Right after, near the snake's mouth, the protagonist tries to grab his dagger, and within seconds, he attacks the snake. As it bleeds, the snake asks what the boy was doing and why this was happening. But the boy says he never trusted those relics, and even if he passed that test, there was no guarantee he would receive his reward normally. Questioning what assurance he had that he wouldn't become a psychopathic killer. Surprised, the snake asks how a mere human could know that. Then the protagonist mentions that the original owner of that relic had actually turned into a serial killer, and the number of victims caused by that relic was huge, saying that the snake was planning to reward him with a fake relic that had a curse inside. In seconds, he lunges at the snake again, telling it pay for the sins it had committed. Then the snake asks if the boy thought he could use the relic normally by doing this. After passing through a tomb full of traps, and if you can pass the relic's test, you'll be rewarded with it. Passing the tests and overcoming all adversities, the relic would grant the user various abilities. This was considered a normal relationship that a human and a relic should share. However, relics have always had a deep hatred for humans, and their goal was to bring suffering. And after spending some time with the relics, people slowly ended up becoming ill. Because of this, users who met healing relics had a lot of power and authority, and that was why he had been exploited by that boss of his. So he didn't need that kind of relationship with the relics, saying he would see how long that snake could endure. The snake in turn was begging Ju-heen to stop. However, the protagonist thinks he would continue to impose his dominance over it. If you need talent in some areas, you should use relics. And if you had no talent, you would be affected by them. Talents are classified by scholars into three main groups. The first is the socialization group. This was a skill to form a positive relationship with some relic. The second was the domination group, which was the charismatic power to make a relic obey you. And lastly, there was the compatibility group, meaning a strong affinity between the user and the relic, as if they were made for each other. In most cases, many people would increase their powers and socialization talents because it was the easiest way of the three. It still allowed them to gain all the benefits of the relic. However, that was the brutal path. And when relics began to become friendly with their owner, they began to emit a poisonous aura that made them sick. So this time, you wouldn't use the socialization method ordering the relic to obey him, because if it didn't, he would cut it into pieces, asking if it thought the protagonist wouldn't do it. At that moment, a light starts to come out of the snake, making him happy because he had really obtained that relic. Soon after, a system screen appears, mentioning that the boy had unlocked a title and a new skill, which was able to increase his knowledge about tombs. Surprised, the boy thinks he now only needs to unlock one more, wondering what he could do to unlock it. Another system screen appears, mentioning that he had unlocked the title and also increased his domination talent. Ju-heen in turn asks that voice why he was considered abusive with that relic, but that didn't matter if his socialization talent had decreased. Shortly after, that group from before appears at the lake again. Grabbing a jar, the man says he was close to grabbing the relic. Then the girl asks what he was planning to do. Next, that man throws the jar into the lake. Ju-heen, in turn, thinks they were very stupid because now it wouldn't do any good. But even so, he would keep watching them for a bit, thinking he had the feeling they would keep getting in his way from that day on, wondering if he should get rid of them. Soon after, a system screen appears again showing that the use of that dagger was already halfway, and that was the voice's way of telling him to think carefully about what he was going to do. Irritated, the man wonders why there was no response because the prophecy said he just needed to throw a relic into the lake. Then the girl asks if there was a user with a prophetic relic in Japan, but the man says that doesn't matter now, because someone must have already gone to that place and taken the relic, asking if that wasn't a problem. Looking at the ground, the girl thinks there were some footprints there, and definitely, someone had been in that place before them. At that moment, they hear a sound coming toward them to see what it was. However, that was just a trick by the protagonist, who thought they were too stupid, asking if they could escape a tomb while it was collapsing. Using his newly acquired relic, it begins to shine. At that moment, the tomb starts to tremble. Quickly, the protagonist begins to leave that place. Outside the tomb, the protagonist is surprised because it was connected to a sewer exit, and that's why his clothes were dirty. Sometime later, when he returned to his apartment, the tomb had already disappeared, and people, at first afraid, all ended up returning to their homes. Shortly after, the protagonist finds his roommate asking why he was still standing there. The boy says that the giant mound had disappeared. Then Joo-hyun says that was good and that they could go inside, mentioning he was starving. However, his friend was still suspicious, asking if it was okay to enter that place. Meanwhile, that man from before was on a call, asking if there was another prophecy where a Korean would get a relic before him, mentioning that the guy should have said that earlier, asking what he was thinking by letting such crucial information slip. But that voice says they only learned about it at that moment, mentioning that the man should know how the future relic user was. Even so, they would do everything to ensure that incident from that day didn't happen again, so they should remain focused and keep working hard. Moreover, it was better to be careful because the person who had stolen that relic didn't seem to be ordinary, as the prophecy about that man was quite disturbing, saying he would be the person capable of devouring the world. Meanwhile, the protagonist at his house was looking at a computer, thinking that language ability was very useful, and now he could search for information in different languages. However, there didn't seem to be anything useful on the internet, as it was still before the existence of relics was known worldwide. So he should find out what that person was planning. However, he couldn't find any information about TKBM. Surprised, his roommate was watching him, asking if the boy really understood that language. Responding yes, the protagonist asks if he needs something, but the boy says he's fine. Joo-hyun asks if he had heard anything about TKBM in the news that day, but the boy says he doesn't remember anything about that, asking why he wanted to know. Joo-hyun says he just wanted to know some details about the leader of that company, but the boy says he didn't have any useful information for him. However, it's not like the owner of that company was big enough to meet with an employee of a small business like his. However, Joo-hyun says he had quit that place, leaving the boy completely surprised by what he had heard. At that moment, the boy seems to remember something, recalling that Park's group had an art gallery, so he would use those guys to get some information about the owner of that company. Meanwhile, Park says those people had taken everything, and the other man asks what they were going to do now, because since they were all arrested, they couldn't continue with that business as they were practically unemployed now. The guy says all of that was because of the protagonist and couldn't let that slide. That's why they should get back at him, and the other man agrees with what he said. At that moment, Park ends up receiving a call, and it was the protagonist calling him. Completely irritated, he asks why he was calling. Right after, he answers the call. The protagonist, in turn, asks why it took him so long to answer. At that moment, Park starts insulting the protagonist, asking how he dared send his boss to jail. Joo-hyun, in turn, asks if they were still in that business, mentioning he knew they hadn't closed their doors yet. But the man didn't want to hear any of that, asking what he wanted because it was his fault all his friends were arrested. Park, in turn, says that if they were still active, that was perfect, because he wanted them to participate in something. Midas was the biggest secret auction house in the world, located in Las Vegas, and that place was known for having the greatest treasures in the world. And he knew that man had participated in an auction and obtained very powerful relics, and Midas was the best place to get all kinds of relics. So if he could get some people to work for him, he would gather some information about that person. Within that month, they should find some objects and locate someone for him in that place. The person they were looking for was named Jack, and if they couldn't find this person there, they should let him know. If they gave any wrong information, they would kill them all. Irritated, Park asked if he was joking, asking how the hell they would get into that place because they could only get there because they had connections and skills. However, Joo-hyun tells them to figure it out, and in any case, unlike them, the protagonist knew things about business. Since he was in charge, they should just consider it a business, and he would pay depending on the quality of the information they provided. But the man says it doesn't matter how much he paid. He didn't want to obey because they had sent his boss to jail. Joo-hyun says that if they didn't like the offer, that was fine because it would be less expense for him, as it didn't matter how they would get to that place. Since it seemed it wasn't clear the last time he beat them up, if that was the case, he would beat them until they decided to go. So he would share the best details next time, and they wouldn't have to wait. Then the protagonist ends the call. With that, his business with that person was resolved, so he should hunt for relics that night. Sometime later, someone seems to be seeing a news report about a 40-year-old woman who tried to leave this world early. Surprised, the protagonist wonders if that incident was a sign for the next appearance of a tomb. But even so, there was also a chance it had nothing to do with it. Then another man appears, asking how long he would stand there because that hallway was very narrow and he couldn't pass. Looking at the man, he wonders why he was there. Because that man was in the Tomb of the Gold Axes, and at that moment, Ju Hyun thinks he understood everything. If that guy was still there, it meant that the next tomb should appear nearby. Because back then, the Japanese had prophetic relic users with them. Noticing the man's insults, the protagonist tells him to shut up, asking if he thought he couldn't understand his language. Surprised, the guy realizes the protagonist speaks Japanese and apologizes for being rude because he had a rough day. However, the guy says he only knew how to speak Korean. Surprised that the guy spoke Korean, the man asks why he had deceived him. But Ju Hyun says it was he who had started it all. Irritated, the guy asks if Ju Hyun knew who he was. Our boy thinks that Bastard had a relic with him, that he didn't even try to mask its aura, but that was to be expected from an amateur like him. Even not knowing what the relic was, he wanted to have it. Grabbing the protagonist's shoulder, the man says if someone was talking to him, they should at least listen to what he had to say. At that moment, the protagonist throws a soda in the man's face, questioning the reason for all that, but the protagonist pretends it wasn't intentional, asking if he was okay. Irritated, the guy says he would pay for that. Reaching into the man's pocket, he realizes it was a bracelet relic in a small box, so stealing it at that moment would be more suspicious. Changing the subject, he says to forget it, and the guy mentions he didn't have any money on him. Moreover, those clothes didn't seem very expensive, mentioning that the man had dropped something, so he should be careful with his identity. Quickly, the guy grabs that document, thinking the protagonist hadn't seen his identity, and if they found out he was a member of the Japanese excavation team, things would get really complicated. At that moment, a tremor starts to happen throughout the entire city. Convinced, the protagonist thinks that man was definitely waiting for that tomb to appear. The guy says it was quite chaotic, and that was exactly what would happen according to his prophecy. Picking up his phone, he calls someone, mentioning that the prophecy had started to come true. The person on the call mentions they had just received a prophecy, and that the person who had stolen his gold and silver relic was nearby. And another part of the prophecy made no sense, which said he needed to be careful with alcohol. Surprised, the boy remembers when the protagonist threw beer at him, assuming the protagonist was the person from the prophecy. People flee the building in a panic. Then the man goes out to search for the protagonist. Ju Hyun wonders why that aura was so bloodthirsty and says it was completely different from the other tomb. Then that man points a gun at the protagonist and tells him not to move. However, a warning appears, saying they had detected an intense aura coming toward them. Right after, the ground cracks beneath them, and everyone is sent to the dungeon. Ju Hyun thinks that a lot of civilians were caught up in the chaos and that the relic definitely brought those people there to harm them. The tomb was filled with broken weapons, and the boy had been to that place in his past life, and he knew it was the dungeon of the Japanese katana relic Muramasa. Muramasa was a famous swordsmith in Japan during the Muromachi period, and he founded the Muramasa school. The katanas made by the school were considered perfect, but during that period, they had an incident with the shogun, and his relatives were killed by katanas made by Muramasa. Because of that, Takugawa ordered all the swords to be destroyed, and rumors that the weapons were cursed katanas began to spread. The protagonist thinks that relic certainly had immense hatred for humans. Another alert informs that the bloodthirsty aura of the relic is affecting his body. Ju even looks at his hand and notices that his skin had already started to get damaged and that he needed to close that tomb quickly. The man again points the gun at the boy and tells him not to move and to open his backpack. The boy, in turn, asks why he should obey him. That guy says it would be better to stop fooling around if he didn't want to get shot. He tells him to go ahead and shoot him, but advises not to do it because it won't work. However, the man doesn't follow the boy's advice and fires, but the gun explodes in his hand. Then Ju Hyun explains that when you're in a tomb, modern weapons don't work. The guy wonders how the boy knew that and says it was probably him who took the silver and gold axes. After that, the protagonist grabs the man and says that relic now belonged to him and that he was in his way. Then he throws the guy into a trap, telling him to stay there, and runs off. The man tells the people everything is under control and asks if anyone knew how to speak Japanese. A civilian says he could speak a little, and the man asks if he could help him. But the people are hesitant to get him out of the trap because he had a gun. The man asks them to trust him because he was from the Japanese excavation team and had even received training to handle the situation properly, promising to get everyone out safely. Meanwhile, Ju Hyun says he will check the relic that man had with him, because when he threw him to the ground, he had taken a look in his pocket. There was only a rope bracelet and a small box with a rice cake inside. That bracelet was a relic from a Korean legend called the brothers who became the sun and the moon. The story tells that a tiger killed their mother to get more rice cakes, and then tried to kill the brothers, but they were saved by a rope that came down from the sky. The boy says that the rank of that relic wasn't the best, but it was still useful. Right after, it is announced that the protagonist had unlocked a title and a skill. Ju Hyun says that now he possessed the 4 basic skills, and because he managed to awaken the 4 dormant skills within him, he would receive a reward as soon as he got out of the tomb. The young man says that Crow really was treating him like a game character. Then he hears a cry for help and wonders what was happening, and notices that the screams were coming from a group of people who had fallen into one of the traps. A woman is holding a knife, threatening everyone who is in the trap. Ju-hyun thinks she might have been possessed because whoever touches that knife will be possessed. The more people are possessed, the harder it will be for people to escape, and in the end, everyone will die because that's the truth behind the trap. As more people die down there, the bridge grows longer. The protagonist asks the people if it was that Japanese guy who told them to go down. They reply that the man had sung some strange song after they got him out of the trap, and right after, he said everyone needed to die to keep some kind of secret. While descending into the trap, Ju-hyun thinks that was probably what a prophetic relic user told him to do. Then he reaches the bottom of the trap, and the possessed girl charges at the protagonist. But the boy uses his relic and restrains the woman, telling her to stay put and that he would keep the knife. But the weapon starts talking to the boy and tells him to kill all the humans. The boy, in turn, asks how a relic like that dared tell him what to do, because a rank C relic isn't even worth using. He then throws the knife away and asks where the chief relic of that tomb was. The young one returns to normal and asks to be untied. Ju-hyun says that relics do whatever they want when left alone and orders the rope to return. After that, the young man tells the civilians to follow him as he will lead everyone out of that place. The man finally reaches the Hall of the Muramasa relic. Now he just needed to retrieve it and get rid of the protagonist. However, all the swords were fake. Shortly after, the civilians reach the man and throw him to the ground while kicking him. Ju-hyun says he can't believe the guy couldn't find the relic even though he arrived first. He then asks the gold axe to locate the real sword, which easily finds the relic. The man wonders how that rusty sword could be Muramasa. Ju-hyun explains that it only shows its true form when it is activated. The sword tells the young man that if he wants to use its power, he must offer 10 sacrifices because it needs human blood. And the young man says weapon relics are always like this. He then refuses to make the sacrifices and asks why he should do that if he could just dominate it. If it didn't obey, the young man would break it into pieces. An explosion of energy occurs, forcing Muramasa back to its true form. And with that, the tomb was completed. With his rope, Ju-hyun tells the people to climb up to get out safely. However, the young man prevents the man from leaving with the rest of the people and asks if he was planning to get rid of those people after they left. The man in turn denies it and begs to be let out. If he was allowed to leave, he would recommend the boy to his country, allowing him to make a lot of money. And they had the relic called the Guide to the Future. With it, the boy could make his life easier. Ju-hyun says that as far as he knows, the Guide to the Future can only be used by the original owner. But the young man says the guy can climb up, but he will be the last to leave. While climbing the rope, the man apologizes for what he did before and says the boy is a skill user who would be welcome in any group. Ju-hyun says he wants to know more about the group that works with the prophetic relic, and that if they were an untrustworthy group, he would refuse the offer to work with them. The man says the young man doesn't need to worry about that, because they are the famous TKBM group. The protagonist smiles, and then kicks the man down, thanking him for the information and saying the man was probably desperate to live to the point of giving away such vital information. Right after, the man is left to die. The protagonist is in the bathroom washing his hands, and his relics start asking to be let out. Ju-hyun says they have to stay quiet and asks who started talking first. Grabbing Muramasa and asking if it was her, the relic in turn tells the boy to let her go. Then he throws the sword into the toilet. Ju-hyun's arm is burned because he forced the domination of Muramasa. To obtain any relic, the normal process would be to pass the tests. But by ignoring that process, the boy suffered some damage by trying to force the domination because the stronger the relic, the more it will resist. If he kept using this method, the young man's body wouldn't last long. But the boy really had no other choice because if he didn't dominate these relics, at some point, all of them would betray him. The announcement panel says the young man will receive a reward for completing the tomb. He had 2 reward choices: the path of domination or the path of socialization. And the boy wonders if that was some kind of test, but decides to choose the path of domination. However, Ju-hyun wonders why he hasn't received anything. Then he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a relic in the form of the silver pill, wondering if he should eat it. Then he says it's not like he has much to lose because if he dies after eating it, then that was fate. And then he decides to eat the pill. He then takes Muramasa out of the toilet and says he regretted putting it there. But the pill starts to take effect, and the boy's wounds begin to heal. Ju-hyun mentions that healing relics are extremely rare and valuable. The panel says the young man has endured the poisonous effects and discovered the immunity skill. It was the first time the young man had seen a skill like that, and maybe it's something created just for him. In the Yeongdeungpo district in Seoul, a major earthquake had occurred, and an unidentified structure appeared at the site. Inside this mysterious building, about 50 people were trapped, and these civilians said there were many traps inside. A witness said there was also someone trying to hurt them. The news report says the government contacted the Japanese government and was waiting for a response. Someone turns off the TV and says that now the media is talking about the tombs and relics. The leader of the Japanese excavation group says it was just an unexpected incident that happened, and the Korean from the prophecy had appeared. One of the men asks if Hiroyuki hadn't said he would take care of the appearance of the Korean from the prophecy. He replies that they could use the guide to the future to locate his whereabouts, because now that he has been marked by the relic of the guide to the future, and since he came into contact with that Korean, even though it's still incomplete, they could now locate him. The students who aren't users of the guide are searching for ways to use this relic without being the original owners, and the TKBM group was also heavily investing. The men say they will give him one more chance in Hiroyuki. In turn, thanks them promising to do his best to eliminate the Korean. Lying on his bed, Ju-hyun thinks that if the tolerance ability is related to the poisons of the relics, then that is incredible. In his past life, they had entered an era where healing relics were the highest priority, and he wonders if it's all because of that crow relic. Right after, he asks what the crow was planning and if it would benefit from giving him such an advantage, and he asks to use the status windows to communicate, but nothing appears. Then he receives a call from Sungwoo, who is in the United States, and says he has looked at the list of auction participants. There were 3 people with the name JK. Ju-hyun says he will have to go look for himself. The panel appears saying that the boy has been marked by an S-rank relic and that his future is now being read. And he wonders if it's the guide to the future. Right after, he tells his friend he will go to the United States, but that he has to stop somewhere first. Prince Shotoku was a politician and ruler during the Asuka period in Japan, and the guide to the future was a prophecy written by him, but there is no evidence of it. But it seems this relic was one of the first to enter human society. Instead of creating a tomb, the relic chose its owner by itself. Sasaki Yuka was the person chosen by the relic of the guide to the future to be its owner. Since then, the item would always follow her wherever she went. Even after grinding, abandoning, and even burning the guide, it always appeared in front of the girl, making her very scared. However, soon the Japanese government discovered the girl's relic and asked her to use the guide to the future to help the Japanese excavation team. Because of this, her family no longer had financial problems and began to live with many benefits. It seemed that everything was going well for Sasaki, but it wouldn't last long, because she dropped out of school to dedicate herself fully and focus on reading the guide to the future. Over time, another user of a prophetic relic appeared and surpassed her abilities, which eventually resulted in her death. At the airport, Ju-hyun thinks he was planning to leave her alone since she would die and disappear, but since they tried to locate him, everything had changed. Besides, they are also involved with CEO Kwan, so he will have to disrupt their plans as much as possible. Meanwhile, someone calls for Sasaki because it's time for her to read her guide to the future. The girl says she always has to read and interpret those complicated messages, and the person in turn replies that if there is a kanji she doesn't understand, she should write it down. Suddenly, the girl screams in fear, saying it was written that she would die, and that it's definitely because of the Korean, as Abe had also died because of him. The couple ask the young girl to calm down and see if there will be any other prophecy. The girl calms down and says she can't lose to the Korean from the prophecy. At Haneda Airport, an emergency is announced for all units, because the Korean relic user they were looking for has arrived. Hiroyuki tells the other soldiers that with this opportunity, they will solve this problem once and for all. While eating his sushi, the protagonist wonders when they will attack him, because he's threatening Sasaki all the time and surely it will show up. Thinking that the guide to the future must have already told Sasaki about the curse he's writing for her, and that it must have caught that relic's attention. Right after, he thinks the Japanese soldiers must have already arrived. On the other side of the door, an armed man asks the chef to stay quiet. The man asks if Sasaki is ready, and the girl in turn says that the young man was trying to kill her, and the cook says she just needs to make eye contact with him. Once the marking is complete, they will know everything about him. And also because the boy doesn't even know what the girl looks like. If things got difficult, it would make sure to bring the girl back. Before entering the room, Sasaki thinks that those gentlemen had told her that the ability to foresee the future is the strongest thing there is. That means she has the advantage. When she opens the door, the young man smiles at her, and the girl is surprised because he was very handsome. While serving the table, she thinks about how those people were trying to kill that boy, because it was such a waste. Ju-hyun thanks her for bringing his food, and he thinks that girl was the user of the future relic, surprised that she came to meet him in person. The soldiers warn that the Korean is pulling a weapon. Outside the room, the men wonder why she didn't leave as soon as she made eye contact. Then the girl closes the door to the room, and turns asking the boy if she could be his fan. But then she remembers that he wasn't a celebrity. Through the cameras, the soldiers wonder why the girl closed the door, assuming that the girl was talking to him, maybe trying to get information out of him. The girl tells Ju-hyun she just wants to talk a little with him. Then she uses the translator to communicate with the young man, who thinks he knows what she's trying to say and wonders how someone like her ended up in such a situation. But this was a good chance for him. Outside, the men say they can't hear anything coming from the room. The table is thrown out of the room, and the men are tied up with a rope. Ju-hyun says he already knew they would try something like this, so he had prepared his rope in advance. Then he tells the girl not to worry because he only tied them up so they wouldn't interfere, and asks if they could go on their date. Ju-hyun asks if the girl wants to go on a date, and she is surprised that he knows Japanese. He replies that he knows a little of the language. Then he says she probably came to him with the Japanese army, and the girl, in turn, confirms what the protagonist said. Ju-hyun says the army doesn't like him and that they probably wouldn't let her go out with him. Even so, they would still escape together, and the young girl thinks he isn't a scary person after all. And if he was really the person who was trying to kill her. As she walks, she thinks she still has the advantage because she had already made eye contact and could read his future. But she remembers she left her guide to the future at home. But she doesn't mind because he wouldn't harm her. However, the boy draws his sword against Sasaki, telling the girl to hand over her phone and not make any noise. He then breaks the girl's phone, saying he was just getting rid of things the army could use to track them because it would be annoying if the Japanese forces came to bother them. And he asks if the girl really thought he didn't know she was the user of the guide to the future. Sasaki wonders what she should do now since he already knew her true identity. Ju-hyun takes the girl to a restaurant, then uses his rope to tie her up. The girl says he was going too far and that she couldn't believe he had faked a date. The protagonist smiles and asks what the girl was talking about, saying they were just spending time together. Sasaki asks if the boy was really going to kill her, as the prophecy said, and the boy, in turn, replies that he was planning to kill her before. If she got too close, he would cut her with Muramasa, but they were there because she was dumber than he thought. Then he asks the girl to get the guide to the future and write down everything she sees. Sasaki replies that she left her relic at home. Ju-hyun shows a tattoo the girl received when she started using the guide to the future, saying that if she touched it, the relic would be summoned, and that he couldn't believe she didn't know such a basic thing. Then the girl touches the tattoo and the guide is indeed summoned. Ju-hyun says she better write down as much as she could, and if she missed a line, he would kill her. Sasaki starts writing in her guide. After a long time, the boy asks why the girl was slowing down, and she replies that it's because her hand was hurting. But the young man tells her to keep writing. The girl says she will give him the guide to the future and asks him to let her go. But Ju-hyun still prefers that she keeps writing. If he wanted the relic, he could have already stolen it from her. But he didn't because the guide was an S-rank relic. That was a considerably high rank. And if he tried to force the domination of a high-level relic, the penalty he would suffer would be too great. Because trying to dominate Muramasa, a relic one rank below the guide, caused great marks on his body. And also, the boy didn't have any healing items with him. The army arrives at the location, and Hiroyuki orders the soldiers to search every room. Ju-hyun says they had finally arrived, and asks how much the girl had written, to which she replies that she was almost at the end of the first notebook. The young man says that's enough, and Sasaki asks if he would let her go. Then the boy draws his sword, and the girl begs him not to do anything to her, saying she could write more prophecies. Ju-hyun asks if the young woman really thought she was that valuable to him, and that Sasaki thought she was the one using the relic, but she was the one being used. But probably that was the only way for her to survive. He then strikes the guide to the future with his sword. Now the boy had unlocked the title of Destroyer of Evil Relics. Soon after, the army bursts into the room where they were. Hiroyuki asks what happened there, and what happened to the guide to the future. Ju-hyun in turn replies that the relic had been destroyed. Then Hiroyuki orders them to kill the protagonist, who says that was a joke, telling them to try to kill him if they thought they had enough skill to do it. Handing something over, Ju-hyun tells them to keep it. That rice cake was a consumable relic, mentioning that it belonged to Abe, so they should return it, saying he heard it tasted like death. At that moment, the guy is surprised because the protagonist had just disappeared, wondering what the boy could be planning. Apparently hypnotized, the man asks what that smell was. Then the three start fighting to grab that food. The soldier says that mochi was his, asking where their manners were. Then a huge fight breaks out in that room. Meanwhile, the protagonist had already left that place, saying there was no better escaped relic than the one he gave them. But anyway, he should see what the Guide to the Future said to do. Thinking that the group supporting the Guide to the Future relic in Japan was TKBM, and because of that, there was a possibility that Sasaki had come into contact with its leader. So it was possible that the prophecy of the Guide to the Future had something about that leader wondering where he was. Shortly after, Ju-hyun seems to find the place. In a month, the underworld would be consumed by greed, and in that place, the omen regarding the world's greatest calamity would begin. Reading that message, Ju-hyun thinks he was sure it referred to the Midas auction house, which was the place where his henchmen and the others went to gather information about that CEO from before, as he said there were 3 people with the initials. But the last part, the omen regarding the world's greatest calamity, must be about that great catastrophe. An event showed the immense influence of relics over the world, because after that happened, everyone became aware of the tombs and the relics increased. However, from what the boy remembered, the great catastrophe didn't happen as soon as before. And besides that, the next line said that the god who understands your greed would ask for your cooperation, which meant that a divine rank relic would appear at the auction house, and the CEO had obtained that relic to become a figure of power. So if that were the case, the protagonist definitely should steal it. Meanwhile, in the Japanese excavation research group meeting room, a man says that even though the woman had regained consciousness, she was still feeling weak, and that the Guide to the Future seemed to be completely destroyed. Another man says that while all this was happening, Captain Mori and his men were shooting at each other, injuring themselves and becoming useless. Irritated, he asks if that made any sense, and if he thought the situation was a joke. Right after, a woman enters the room saying it had been confirmed that the guide to the future was destroyed and that the Japanese Defense Force had also suffered damage. The person on the call asks if she was saying that one person had caused all that, and the woman says it seemed to be the case. The person asks who the crazy person was and what they should do now, and if they should avenge their losses, but the woman says that isn't necessary. However, the amount they invested in that future guide research project was completely lost. The man says that's true, but they should think a bit more because if that person managed to destroy the future guide, it meant they had an immense amount of power. He asks if it wouldn't be better to recruit someone like that for their group. The girl says that person destroyed an extremely valuable prophetic relic without hesitation, which means they could do the same with the relics of their company. She asks what they would do if that happened. But the man smiles, saying that wouldn't be a problem because if he promised a large amount of money, it would solve everything. Meanwhile, the protagonist was in a building drinking something, wondering why those people were late. Shortly after, that group from before arrives. Annoyed, Ju Hyun says they were half an hour late, but the boy says it was because of the other guy. The butler says that in that auction house, only participants could enter. If they weren't, they should leave immediately, and if they continued acting that way, they would use force to remove them. Then, interfering in the situation, the protagonist mentions that they were his guests and that he would take responsibility for them. The waiter apologizes, mentioning that he made a mistake, but the boy says it was okay and understandable given their lack of style. Surprised, Park asks if the protagonist knew how to speak English. Ju Hyun says that doesn't matter, asking them to sit down and tell him what they knew. Looking at a piece of paper, the protagonist thinks those documents are about the 3 people with the initials JK. Surprised that they really researched this, he assumes that after all, those 3 were useful to him. Park asks if Ju Hyun managed to find the person he was looking for, and the boy says yes, thinking that was definitely the fake identity his boss was using. And if that man was in that place, he would have an extremely valuable relic in that auction house, so he would take a look, because it was really possible that a divine ranking relic could appear there. Park asks why he is looking at the auction catalog since only multi-billionaires come to that place, and if he made any good offer, he would end up having to sell even his body to pay for it. Looking at the paper, Ju Hyun doesn't find any divine ranking relics, wondering what that prophecy was talking about. Answering Park's question, the boy says there were some relics he wanted to have. Surprised, Park asks if the protagonist was going to participate in the auction and if he was kidding him because they were talking about an auction house. Since the initial bids are usually between 10 billion to 20 billion, and they only came there to make some contacts, they never planned to buy anything. Convinced, the protagonist asks if he was saying he didn't have the money to buy there. Leaving, he asked if they forgot that this was the city of gambling and that they could do anything as long as they had money. Park asks if the protagonist was thinking of betting money, wondering if he really was a crazy guy. Looking at a machine, the boy wonders how long those numbers would keep rising, and since there were still 10 more rounds, that number could go up even more. He wonders how such a machine could give so much money. However, it was going to get even crazier. Everyone around was completely surprised by what the protagonist was doing. Soon after, the boy seems to withdraw his money, saying they should go somewhere else, asking them to stop staring at him and follow him because he was going to exchange the money. Surprised, Park says Ju Hyun had scored an absurd amount of points. At that moment, someone seems to stop the boy, asking if it was okay to search him since they never had someone score as many points as he did. Then the boy, without any concern, says it's okay to do that because they wouldn't be able to find anything. The man, in turn, asks what that was in his hand, and the boy says it was just a souvenir he bought earlier. Looking at the object, the man says the protagonist was right and that it was just a regular souvenir. However, that was a relic from that dungeon of the gold and silver axes. At that moment, a voice starts coming out of the object, asking how long it would have to stay in that embarrassing form. Changing the form of relics was one of the most important abilities of a user, and his relic had the ability to detect valuable items and money. Because of this, he could know in advance which machines would give him the most money. Additionally, he could know which casino would give a bigger payout. Then another man interrupts the protagonist's thoughts, apologizing and mentioning that he really was very lucky. Park is surprised because Ju Hyun actually wasn't caught cheating. Moreover, the staff checked the machine and didn't find anything unusual, which meant the boy could go to another casino now. Shortly after, the young man was already at the reception to collect his money, and the girl says she would have to escort him to his VIP area first. Thanking her, the boy says he just wanted to get his money quickly. Park, happy, says he has never seen so much money in his life. They wondered if that wasn't enough to live a peaceful life for the rest of their days, and now they were millionaires. However, the protagonist says that money wasn't for them. But the men didn't care because, even so, that amount of money was ridiculous, asking if they really had to participate in the auction, wondering if it wouldn't be better to take all that money and go home. The protagonist thinks that his goal was to acquire the relics from the auction house, and also that if he wanted to compete against the CEO, he would need a bit more money. After finishing his meal, the protagonist suggests going for another round in the casinos. Near a casino, that relic says it smells money, asking when it could return to its original form. However, it didn't matter because it would just enjoy the smell of desperation from the casinos and their losses a little longer. Changing the subject, the protagonist asks it to hurry up and find the machines that would yield more money. Then a system screen appears for Ju Hyun, warning that he had entered a place the relic appreciated a lot and that his socialization with the relics had increased. The boy thinks that even though casinos are good places to make money, there is still a problem. Similar to battlefields, casinos are places where humans feel despair and suffering. So he had to get the money quickly and get out of that place. Then a voice calls the protagonist. A boy appears, questioning what was in his backpack and why it was like that. Opening it, the protagonist seems surprised by the contents, realizing it was a silver axe. While the gold axe has the ability to find wealth, the silver axe has the ability to find and mark enemies who are a threat to its master. Wondering why that damn thing was reacting. In the background, two people seem to be arguing because someone cheated, and a huge argument starts to break out. While Park was wondering what was happening, someone with bad intentions was behind him. However, he wasn't the target as he was aiming at the protagonist, demanding he hand over his money. Within seconds, Ju Hyun takes down the man, saying that judging by his clothes, he was from that casino's group, asking if he was crazy. The boy thinks that no tomb should be appearing in that place, wondering what was going on. Looking to the side, a blonde-haired girl appears. Everyone is surprised by the girl's beauty. Quickly, the protagonist tells them to grab their things and leave the place, thinking he had never expected to find that woman there. Mentioning that everything would be a mess shortly, so they should avoid that woman. Her name was Irene, the youngest daughter of the wealthy Hilton family. However, that wasn't all about her. Divine ranking relics are the strongest of all, and users who possess them can stand above all others. Because of this, these users obtain titles of gods, such as gods of fate, gods of conquest, and gods of wealth. And these users had absolute authority in the era of relics. Among those people, Irene was a very frightening user whose relic was called the Goddess of Failure, which caused anything that came near to suffer extreme bad luck. Some people lost all their money and went bankrupt. Moreover, she caused a global-scale financial crisis, so it was best to avoid her at all costs. Then that girl notices the protagonist asking the boy to wait a moment. Pretending not to see her, the boy tries to leave. Just as he's about to exit, several system screens start appearing in his vision, warning that a threatening aura had been detected coming from his door and that the relics in his possession could suffer critical damage. Therefore, the allowed amount of his relics would be consumed on a larger scale. Touching the protagonist, the girl asks him to listen to what she had to say. Irritated, Ju Hyun thinks he is cornered. As the girl starts to touch the protagonist, a purple aura begins to emanate from her hand. The system warns that he is being trapped by a harmful aura, and because of it, his relics have started to suffer. Additionally, his luck is being overshadowed by a threatening presence, and anything he tries based on luck will result in failure. Quickly, the protagonist asks the girl to let him go. Apologizing, the girl says she got too excited to see him and ended up crossing the line. Noticing the boy's behavior, the other man asks why he's acting that way. The other young man then says he remembered who that woman was. When they learned she was from the Hilton family, everyone was surprised because that was an extremely wealthy family. Iron asks who the boy was since he managed to hit the jackpots in the casinos, and because of that, she was looking for him. And if he agreed, she wanted to know how he managed to do all that. Ju Hyun wonders why one of the richest people in the world would be curious about that, as it was very strange. Mentioning she must be mistaken. Park asks if he didn't know who that woman was because her name was Irene, who came there to ask the protagonist for help, asking him to stop since they were going to talk to the girl and calm things down, so he shouldn't miss that chance. Park, talking to the woman, asks her to wait a bit. As a consequence, the people who got close to her ended up having bad luck. Quickly, the protagonist orders them to get away from her. Sometime later, the two were already outside that building, and the protagonist says they should stay as far away from that woman as possible. The confused man asks what he was talking about. Ju Hyun says that when they recover, they should find a place and protect their bags of money. Asking where the boy was going, Ju Hyun says he was heading to the auction house, and that after he was done, he would call them to bring the money. Thinking he planned to win much more before going to the auction, however, he couldn't do anything because he might end up losing even more. Sometime later, the boy was already at the designated location, thinking there shouldn't be any reason for that woman to come after him. Then a man seems to block the boy, saying that entrance was only for extremely important VIPs, and that commoners like him shouldn't go through that place. Observing the man, Ju Hyun thinks he was that CEO's right-hand man, mentioning that he was much younger than before and his face was still unmistakable, which meant if he was there. Soon after, that CDO appears and the man asks if they could go in now. With a threatening look, the young man watches that man, thinking they had finally met. However, that man ends up passing by because he apparently didn't recognize the young man, thinking he would take all the relics he tried to get during the auction because this time, he would be the winner. Meanwhile, a group of people, while looking at their cell phones, notices their stocks are falling. Additionally, their phones were not working properly. Then, when the protagonist looks to the side, he notices that girl from before, questioning why she followed him to that place. Noticing the young man, the girl asks him to wait a moment, begging to listen to her a little because she had nothing left to do and was now desperate. Trying to flee, the protagonist ends up hitting his face against a wall. The girl, in turn, asks if he was okay, and if he had hurt himself. Irritated, Ju-hyun asks if he looked okay to her, telling her to stop following him because this was happening because of her. However, Iron says that was exactly her problem. Confused, Ju-hyun wonders what kind of answer that was. Iron says she doesn't know if the protagonist would believe what she had to say, but it seems she was causing bad luck to everyone around her. That's why she wanted her luck to be as great as the protagonist's, because she believed that was the only way to make the people around her happy again. Ju-hyun thinks she was the goddess of failure who destroyed the finances of several people and caused disasters in many countries. However, he wonders why she was acting that way and if she was possibly pretending. Holding the protagonist's hand, the girl pleads, asking what she should do to make her luck as good as his, and she was willing to do anything. So could he tell her the truth? Then the system states again that he is being harmed because of that girl. However, a sort of tolerance towards her has started to form. Surprised, the protagonist assumes that ability came from taking that silver pill, because back then, it was said he only knew of the existence of the ability. Assuming it finally activated because of that, he wonders if the girl triggered his ability because of her bad luck. Right after, the protagonist says it's all right, thinking that since this happened, there was no reason to avoid that woman now. He could use her during the auction, ruining the chances of the other participants, and thus kill two birds with one stone. Looking to the side, he notices that CEO from before, who appeared to be irritated because his factory in China suddenly caught fire, asking what he meant by that. Observing that situation, Ju-hyun thinks that he too was under the effects of that girl's relic. If it were before, Iron would have left that place immediately. This meant she wasn't aware of the existence of the goddess of failure, so he could end up making good use of that woman, saying that the proposal she made didn't seem bad. However, she should understand one thing: obtaining luck is difficult, and even if she wanted to talk about the details of that deal, he would have to go to the auction soon. However, if she agreed to those conditions, she could go to the auction with him. But it was completely understandable if she didn't want to, since the ticket price was quite high. But for Irene, money wasn't a problem. Convinced, Ju-hyun thinks he already knew she would go, as the entrance fee was like pocket change to her. So he was curious about what kind of person she would become. Shortly after, the announcer says the auction is about to begin. Looking around, the protagonist thinks the place was quite empty, because after letting Iron go with him within 3 minutes, the number of participants was cut in half, and most of them left to deal with their sudden problems. However, it seemed that the CEO hadn't left even with his factory in China being on fire, which meant he definitely wanted something in that auction. Observing the item, Iron says it was apparently a royal Russian wine that had been aged for over 100 years, asking if the protagonist was going to place a bid. However, the items that interested Ju-hyun would only appear in the final part of the auction. Looking at the girl, the protagonist thinks she really was the goddess of failure, mentioning that she was completely different from what he remembered. However, she didn't seem to be pretending. The strangest part of that confusion was the fact that she seemed unaware of the relics, wondering if that was really possible, because the relic she had attached itself to her without her even knowing. And this meant that originally the goddess of bad luck was actually a kind-hearted person. But because of the bad luck of the relic that attached itself to her unknowingly, her life changed drastically, which also caused her personality to change. Then the girl says she wanted the protagonist to know she was really grateful for what he was doing, for listening to her and believing what she had said. Because of that, she felt much better, just having someone to talk to about her problems. But the boy says that it wasn't a big deal. The system warns that due to the improvement in the user's mood, the relic is starting to intensify. Thus, its power increased explosively. The girl in turn says she was very happy. At that moment, an earthquake begins to occur, and the system warns that the relic has spread to an area of 1 kilometer and immense bad luck has started to surround that place. His relic starting to speak as it's beginning to crack in half, asking what his master was doing. Ju-hyun can't believe how happy she gets. However, the effects of her relics also end up being the same, but at least his tolerance ability was slowly increasing. And if it continued like this, his relics would end up breaking. He asked the girl not to be too hopeful about it because he would feel bad if they couldn't reach an agreement in their deal. Besides, just because her luck would increase, he questions how she would stop the bad luck she brings to the people around her. Iron says he is right, but thought it didn't guarantee that would happen. Then the system warns that due to the worsening mood of the user, the strength of the relic returned to normal. Meanwhile, the announcer says it seems there was a small tremor in the place, but apparently everything has already been resolved, and the current bid is $770,000, asking if there would be another bid. Then another man raises his hand, making a bid of $1 million, and a fight broke out over that item to see who could grab more money. Watching the two, the protagonist thinks they weren't in a normal mental state because of the relic's aura, so he could use this aura to eliminate the rest of the participants, telling Iron not to be sad because it wasn't guaranteed that increasing her luck would solve her problem of bringing bad luck to others, so they should get back to business, asking if she said she wanted to know how to increase her luck. Then he would tell her how to do it. Thus, the protagonist deliberately told the girl favorable things to put her in a good mood, tricking her into believing he could solve everything. And since she was in a state of great happiness, the aura of her relic became much stronger than before. As a result, the participants lost all reason and began bidding on everything they saw, thus ending up spending all their money on useless items. Since everyone spent their money on anything they saw in the first half of the auction, he managed to get all the relics he wanted in the second half. However, there were some relics he had to give up to that CEO, and that was because he wasn't affected by the relic's aura. And that was probably because his domination trait was too high. But his knowledge about relics was better than the CEO's because the relics he gave to the CEO weren't very useful. And the divine ranking relic mentioned in the prophecy still hadn't revealed itself, thinking that this auction was about to end in a very strange way. Then Iron asks if the boy would continue with their deal because it seemed he was just stalling and deceiving her all this time. Joo-hyun apologizes, saying it was time to get a bit more serious, so they should go to a quieter place to finalize the details and conclude their agreement. Right after, the announcer says they will start their surprise event of the night and reveal their final item, a mysterious almond sapling that has attracted a lot of attention lately. Observing that relic, the man seemed surprised by what he had seen. That was the elixir plant, a divine ranking relic, and not only that, but it was also a regeneration type along with healing. Raising his hand, the protagonist thinks he must get it no matter what. Looking to the side, he notices that the CEO from before had also raised his hand to bid. There was an emperor who had been a powerful monarch, and rumors saying that the elixir of life was discovered, so he sent his servants to find it. And after many years of searching, the elixir was found, and it was that item. And before he died, that relic was already in the possession of the previous CEO. At that time, his body was taken over by a disease due to the deadly auras of the relics, and because of this, he was placed in a position where he had to rely on the fruit this plant produced in order to survive. As a result, instead of receiving payment for his work, he was only rewarded with the fruit and ended up having to do everything the CEO asked of him. Surprised, Joo-hyun thinks that it was in that place where the man got that relic in the past. However, this time it would be the protagonist who would get that relic. Surprised, the announcer thinks that competition was to be expected because the fruit of that tree was known to restore virility in a magnificent way. Joo-hyun asks what he meant by restoring virility, mentioning that it was very embarrassing. Then a bidding war begins between the two to see who could make the best offer for that tree. Looking ahead, the boy notices other people also placing their bids. Then that CEO makes an offer of $10 million for that fruit. Surprised, Joo-hyun thinks that man really wasn't going to give up, knowing that relic was a divine rank recovery relic. Even not knowing how much he knew about that relic, he couldn't compete with him when it came to money, asking to start the deal with the girl at that moment, mentioning that he promised to find a solution to her problem, but in exchange he wanted her to get that tree for him. Asking if the girl agreed to do that, Iron says that sounded good because when it comes to money, she wouldn't lose. Meanwhile, people were still placing their bids for that tree. Surprised, the announcer says they were already at an offer of $50 million, asking if anyone would make another bid. Then that CEO makes an offer of $100 million, which surprises everyone around. Yoo-hyun thinks that anything above $100 million was out of his budget, therefore it was a lost relic for him from the beginning. Once again, the announcer asks if anyone else would like to make a bid. Then the girl raises her hand, making a bid of $150 million. Joo-hyun thinks this is a perfect time for a switch. Everyone around is surprised by the bid the girl has made. However, it still isn't enough because that man makes a bid of $160 million. But once again, the girl makes a bid of $200 million, surprising everyone with the bid she made. Her assistant says it might be better to give up on that relic because if he wasn't mistaken, that woman was Irene, the youngest daughter of the wealthy Hilton family, and the amount of money they had was immeasurable. However, the man doesn't care about that and makes a bid of $220 million, saying he wasn't going to back down now that he had come this far. Watching the situation, Joo-hyun thinks this is a very enjoyable sight. They managed to beat that man by double the amount, and in the end, the elixir went to Irene for $500 million. Sometime later, Joo-hyun was toasting with the girl, saying the price she had paid was very high, but to her, it was nothing, asking if he planned to share his luck with her or provide some kind of charm to increase her luck or something else. However, the boy says he had nothing he could give. Distressed, the girl asks if he was deceiving her, but the protagonist asks her to listen until the end, mentioning that her problem wasn't something that could be solved by gaining more things, and that the way to solve it was by removing something from her. In short, he just needed to remove an object she had, thinking that the only way to solve the problem was to get rid of that relic. But doing that would allow him to acquire the bad luck relic, which in the end was an even more beneficial situation, saying that he was sure she must have noticed that she possessed a strange object that followed her wherever she went. However, Irene says she didn't have an object like that. Joo-hyun says that's impossible, telling her to try throwing away all the belongings she had with her now, because one of them could be responsible. The girl says she had already tried that before, but they always came back to her. Again, the boy asks if she had any tattoo that appeared on her body one day. Noticing the girl seems a bit surprised, the protagonist thinks she definitely had one. In general, relics are divided into two main categories, disposable and possession. And there are also tattoo relics that appear on the bodies of users, which are possession relics. So she probably had one, forming a bond with the future guide, a possession relic that is formed as a sign of becoming its master. Anyone can use disposable relics, but these relics have an internal usage limit. However, Unlike them, possession relics have no usage limit but can only be used by their masters. Taking out her phone, the girl asks if she can show a photo of herself. Observing the mark of that relic, the protagonist seems to know what it is. Nervously, Iron asks if there was a problem. Ju Hyun thinks her relic is a parasitic type and these are quite rare, living forcibly within the user's body. Since her relic was a divine ranking one with a reputation for bringing bad luck, he expected it to be something like the golden apple of Eris, wondering what kind of relic she had. However, one thing was certain, he wouldn't be able to extract this frightening ability from her body. But even so, there was still a way to resolve that. Ju Hyun says he thought it would be something simpler. However, it seemed he was mistaken. Handing her a piece of paper, the protagonist says that it was his number, and that they would talk when they had more time, as they would try to find a solution together. As he leaves, he thinks that if he can't forcefully extract this ability, it would be better to make her his ally. So forming connections with others wasn't a bad idea either, as it could be useful someday. Then the announcer says that since he had made the payment for the tree, it was now his, and the other items could be settled after payment. Turning on his phone, the protagonist says he would ask his subordinates to come make the payment. Annoyed, the young man wonders why they aren't answering the phone, assuming something must be wrong, and that he must have missed something while still thinking about more important matters. Saying he needed to ask a favor from the announcer, mentioning that it wasn't much except for the fact that he would be well compensated. Meanwhile, the group of people who were with the protagonist seems to be apparently stealing his money. Saying they could rest now since they were still out of breath, he asked if everyone had their bags. It was amazing because, with that money, they could live the rest of their lives without any problems. Shortly after, the protagonist appears, saying they had the guts to take his money and then try to run away. Thinking that using the gold and silver axe, it was very easy to find those three. He tells them not to make any excuses unless they want to have their heads chopped off. Taking something out of his pocket, he says he really has to use it. Pulling out a kind of stone, he tells them to keep watching because they would soon find out what it was. In an instant, a giant statue appears behind the young man. There was a code of laws created by a king during ancient Babylon. One of the most famous phrases contained within it was the law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And the phrase stated that whatever your enemy had done would be returned to them, making it the perfect relic for counterattacks. Mentioning it was a relic he acquired at the auction house, which he got a bit earlier than usual due to a favor he did for one of the staff. Using that relic, Ju Hyun seems to bind the three, thinking he wasn't sure if it would work the way he wanted, but it seemed everything went well. And as mentioned, that phrase was meant to return any attack the enemy used against him. However, that code was a book of law, and he was curious if that relic could also restrict the present and future actions of enemies. Surprised, Park asks what the boy had done to them. Ju Hyun says he was just testing the strength of the relic, and that as long as they didn't betray him from now on, nothing bad would happen to them. However, if they tried anything, their bodies would be cut into pieces, which could be considered as if they had signed a contract of slavery with him. Nervously, another man says he seems to be telling the truth because a stone pillar had appeared and disappeared very quickly. Park asks if he was some kind of psychic, and the protagonist quickly replies that he was. Also, they'd have another leader soon, but they would be fine because they were with the protagonist. Even though it was a slave contract, it wasn't a bad thing, because he would compensate them if they did their jobs well, and they would earn more money than they had just stolen. Accepting the offer, the man still seemed to have a doubt, asking what kind of work they would have to do, but they would find out soon. So the day passes, and the protagonist, along with his henchman, is in a kind of hotel. Asking why they were confused, he says that this was part of their job. Questioning if they were seeing that little pot because their mission was to take care of that plant, ordering them to pick it up and put it in a pot, mentioning it was worth more than 500 million, so they should take good care of it. Watching the three, the protagonist thinks they really had a high socialization trait. The previous night, Ju Hyun managed to make a forced pact with that plant. However, it screamed so loudly that he couldn't even sleep because it hated users with a strong domination trait and generally preferred those with socialization traits. So it seemed those three were perfect for that plant. Thus, Ju Hyun left them taking care of that plant mainly because he didn't want to handle that thing, but it seemed they were indeed perfect for the job. At that moment, the boy receives a call, wondering if it was really the person he was thinking of. Answering the call, he thinks that even though he hadn't saved that enemy, he already had an idea of who it could be. Then someone on the call says it was the CEO of TKBM named Kwan. Surprised, the protagonist thinks that it was really that old man's number, and since he was calling, it meant he had already started investigating him. The man says he would get straight to the point because he heard that he was the one who obtained that miraculous tree, so he would like to talk with him a bit about that matter. Quickly, the protagonist says he has nothing to discuss with him, and since he was busy, he would hang up. Noticing his boss irritated, the man asks what the problem was, questioning if the conversation didn't go well. Annoyed, the CEO says he didn't even listen to what he had to say and quickly hung up. But even if he was ignorant, he still had that relic with him, and of all the ones he had seen so far, that one had the strongest aura. So he should have done everything he could to seize that relic the previous night, because if it weren't for his interference, he would have fought to the end. Kneeling, the man asked for forgiveness, thinking he had solved that problem somehow. But in reality, it would be a chance to gain more recognition. So he would take full responsibility and do everything he could to ensure he got the sapling. Asking if it was okay to dirty his hands to get that relic since it was just a commoner, it wouldn't be too difficult. Annoyed, Park asks why he spoke that way because he was the most influential and powerful person in his country. However, without even wanting to hear about it, the protagonist says they were being very rude to him, asking if they wanted him to split their heads in half, mentioning he was going out for a bit and ordering them to keep taking care of that tree. And if they tried anything again, they would find out what would happen to them. Leaving his hotel, he thinks the CEO is the type of person who would do anything to get something. Soon enough, he would find out his location and try to surround him. So if he wanted to keep that plant safe, he would have to deal with those pursuing him. Since the silver axe was reacting, that meant they had already started to track him down. Thus, the protagonist went out on purpose to deceive whoever was following him. Eventually, they ended up crossing paths. Seeing the man, the young man thinks he apparently was working alone. So it seemed they were really underestimating him. Noticing he had a relic, even though the aura was masked, he could still feel it. Looking to the side, that man ends up spotting the protagonist. Seeing the man approaching, the protagonist thinks he easily took the bait without even realizing he had fallen into his trap. Then the man gets angry because the protagonist simply ignored him, asking if he was listening. However, once again, he ends up ignoring the poor man, who angrily asks if the boy was listening because when someone was talking to him, he should at least respond. Within seconds, the protagonist knocks the man to the ground, asking how he had the nerve to yell at someone when he had just seen them. And if he had any business with him, he should at least call him politely. He easily feels the relic's aura even stronger now, so he wanted to have it at any cost. Angry, the man asks how the boy dared to hit him. The protagonist in turn says he should probably take etiquette classes. But anyway, it seemed he had some important business with him, so he would listen to what he had to say. The man mentions they met last night and his discussion was about that. However, the protagonist says he doesn't remember him, leaving the man irritated again. Joo-hyun says he saw him there, asking if he was that loser licking the feet of that old man, leaving the man completely infuriated by what he had heard. Then the system warns that the opponent was starting to lose his composure, and thus his control of the relics had diminished. That man had always been easily affected by what others said, and even though he acted like he was important on the outside, he had an inferiority complex. He was once the heir to a great company, but because of his behavior, he messed up, playing around too much, and was eventually fired. And it was thanks to the CDO that he achieved some success in life. When he worked for TKBM, that bastard did everything he could to pick a fight with him. Grabbing a club, the man asks if he was done talking because he wouldn't let it slide. Because of this, the man became unable to use high-ranking relics properly. And that was because the control over relics heavily depended on the user's condition, mentioning the CDO had called him earlier, stating he really needed that vitality plant and asking what he wanted him to do. Irritated, the man asks what he was talking about, and the boy says he was just saying that he wouldn't be able to hand over that plant so easily. But if he asked nicely, he might give it to him because it was something he received as a gift, so he could really give it away if he wanted. Bowing to the protagonist, he thanks him for his cooperation, asking if he could give him the plant because it was very important. The man thinks the protagonist could wait because after getting the plant, he would tear him to pieces. Bursting into laughter, Joo-hyun asks if he really believed that. Angry, the man seems to grab a potion, mentioning he should have done that from the beginning. Calmly, the protagonist seems to dodge, saying it would be better if he didn't do that. Confused, the boy wonders why it wasn't working. Then Joo-hyun grabs the man's head, rubbing it against the wall. The system warns that his temper had drastically decreased and the opponent's control over the relics had dropped to rank D. The man wonders if he really knew about relics. The boy in turn says he knew everything, so he was going to take his, mentioning that it was a possession relic and that its new master was now the protagonist. The relic in turn says that the protagonist's strength wasn't bad and that it would be under his care. As he poured the potion on the man started begging him not to do it. The name of that relic was Voodoo Powder of the Zombie Priest. Although it wasn't just a rank possession relic, it also had an amazing ability. One of the beliefs was that anyone guilty of their sins would be turned into a zombie. Thus, that rumor gained great traction and was considered true, which eventually gave birth to that relic. And if you touch or inhale that powder, you temporarily lose consciousness and become a zombie. The boy says that should delay the CEO's actions in trying to pursue him, so he needed to hurry and grab his things while he still had time, mentioning that it was time to get out of that place. Looking at something, the CEO doesn't seem pleased, and the other man asks if that guy was one of his henchmen. About to leave, the man asks again what he had asked, and the other man says he was the leader of his department. Looking at the phone, a piece of news appears in broad daylight. A guy did a striptease, swimming completely without any clothes. The other man asks what they should do because it seemed like they weren't willing to turn a blind eye to that case. So the man says there wasn't much to do in that case. They should follow the protagonist's orders. That problem spread not only in the United States, but also throughout Korea. And his name was linked to this issue as he was associated with that scandal, ordering them to recover the relic that man was using right now. However, when they arrested that guy, he didn't have any relic, and it seemed all of his belongings were confiscated or stolen by someone. So they would start investigating the places he had been walking around. But for the CEO, that wasn't necessary because it was pretty obvious who had done that to the man, as it was definitely Ju Hyun, who likely had a big company covering for him and might also be skilled with relics, ordering them to call his lawyer, because in the end he was just a kid and would stay quiet if someone gave him some candy to eat. Inside an airport, Park asks the protagonist what happened that time. Then the boy orders them to make sure they don't lose anything because that would be their security fund from now on. However, for Park, it didn't seem like anything valuable. Ju Hyun thinks he had obtained some relics and now just needed to take them all safely back to Korea. The relics they got in Korea were the knife and the gold and silver axe. At the auction house, he also got others, and last but not least, the medicinal plant of that emperor. That was more than enough to fund his relic excavations, so he would be able to get even more from now on. Soon after, someone appears asking if he was Ju Hyun, mentioning she was TKBM's exclusive lawyer. Looking at the woman, he thinks she is the left-hand woman of the former CEO, wondering what she was plotting. Sometime later, the protagonist was eating with that woman, mentioning that she knew he had the CEO's belongings, and that there was no need to deny or defend himself about it. In fact, the president thought his skills were excellent for securing that man's positions from before and was there to offer him a job. The boy says he was wondering why she had come to that place, but it was merely about a slavery contract. The woman says his words were quite bold, so he wouldn't receive any offer like that and that they would pay him $100 million. Moreover, there would also be an annual salary, and they wouldn't interfere in his daily life. His job would only be as an affiliate of TKBM. However, the protagonist immediately interrupts, questioning what would happen if he refused the offer, mentioning that it had no value to him and that he already knew what that old man was planning. The woman says she would give him some advice because when talking to someone else, it's better to choose your words carefully. However, she would let it pass since he was still young and lacked life experience, asking if he had thought about the kind of consequences his act of theft could cause, as he or someone in his family could end up disappearing without a trace. And the protagonist says now she was showing her true colors, questioning if she was trying to threaten him, basically saying that if he didn't want to, he would die because he would have to work for them. Then the boy says he has some advice for her. When trying to pick a fight with someone, you should always choose your opponents wisely. That will obviously be a reasonable value for your life. Taking out that potion, he says the only person who would disappear without a trace would be her. Looking at the potion, the boy says she wouldn't be able to use that relic with so many people around. Opening the potion, the young man says she was very confident about all this, asking if she really thought he couldn't do it. Park and his friends notice the situation, asking if that sound didn't come from the cafe where Ju Hyun was. Desperate, the woman falls to the ground, begging the protagonist to take it away, asking if he was crazy, not believing he was using the relic. Our boy says he didn't care if the world knew about the existence of relics or not because he was different from all of them, asking if they wanted to film that, asking if it wasn't nice to see all those shiny powders everywhere. And since the girl was still fine after coming into contact with him, her control over relics must be very high. And if she had any relics with her, she better use them now because his next attack wouldn't be so easy to avoid. Quickly, the woman seems to pull out a relic, launching an attack toward the boy. He quickly summons that statue again, which easily repels the attack. She is surprised because her attack was reflected back at her. Noticing the axe the boy had pulled out, the girl starts to beg, asking him to forgive her. Park asks what he was doing and if he was really planning to kill someone in broad daylight. However, the boy says that it wouldn't kill anyone but would destroy everything of value she had. Then a group of police officers appears, mentioning they heard an explosion sound from the cafe ahead and that it could be a terrorist attack. Also, they received a call from a woman who was abusing people near the cafe. Annoyed, the CEO asks how the protagonist dared to do that. Taking that object, the protagonist says the woman had dropped that relic, wondering what kind of ability it had. Park, questioning what relics were, the boy says they would find out soon enough. Picking up that relic, it starts to speak, asking to follow what its voice commanded because the place they were in would soon fall into deep chaos. The confused protagonist asks if it was that voice from the beginning. A confused Park asks what he was talking about because he was scaring him. Noticing the boy, the protagonist thinks that only he could hear that voice, asking the relic to stop talking to him because it had sent him to the past without any warning and turned him into a cheap imitation of a game. Again, the voice says he will regret not following its orders, and the protagonist says not to joke about it, asking if it thought he would believe that. Then the president appears, mentioning that the boy had put on quite a show, asking if he was Ju Hyun. The protagonist then confirms that he is. The man says it was the first time they were meeting. When Park was about to greet the man, he realizes his body wasn't moving. Looking at the man, the protagonist seems to notice something strange as a red aura starts emanating from his body. Quickly, the boy grabs his weapon, immobilizing the president, saying it was a bit problematic to act like that, so he shouldn't try to dominate humans, especially if they were someone else's subordinates. So it was probably better if the president stopped all that. Understanding the situation, the president says he gets it. That was the reason his subordinates were put in that state. Releasing his relic, the protagonist's group seems to be free from that curse. The president mentions that his skills were better than expected, and he also seemed to have a special talent for controlling those relics, so he wouldn't be able to hold back like before, mentioning that there was a prophecy he heard some time ago that said the day would come when the world would know about the existence of relics. And since he didn't want that to happen yet, there were still many things he wanted to do. So he ended up reaching a conclusion. If he got rid of everyone who knew about the existence of relics, the day the prophecy mentioned would be delayed. Attacking the protagonist, the man says that was the perfect reason to get rid of people like him. Park, surprised, says that it was happening again. Without any fear, the boy says that the CEO was finally showing his fangs. Confused, the CEO asks why they were not disappearing, as that relic should have sent them to a dimension far away from his. Taking out a piece of paper, the protagonist asks if he was talking about that, saying he had just stolen his relic. He adds that, as he could see, he was very skilled with his hands, stating he would make good use of it. Irritated, the CEO asks how he dared to steal his relic, and the protagonist says he should have done a better job protecting it, thinking about how the skill he used to praise was his light fingers and asking how he felt now. This system alerts that his stealing skill had been unlocked to rank D, thinking if he was still going to continue with that game business. However, that didn't make any difference, as he should only express the status of that relic to him. That was a rank D relic, and his domination control was still a bit low for that type of relic. But only for now, because he really wanted to send that old man to another dimension. The CEO asks if he was still willing to fight because he had made a big mistake if he thought that was the only relic he had. The protagonist thinks he always knew that the CEO always carried several powerful relics with him, and one of the strongest he possessed was the Conqueror's Relic, which had the power to take control of another person's mind and make them completely obedient. Joo-hyun never discovered precise details about that relic since he always kept it a secret, and all he knew was that it resided somewhere in his body, so he could try cutting off his arms and legs to gain more information. However, that was something he couldn't do since that bastard also had a golden relic. In other words, his body was basically an impenetrable fortress equipped with extremely strong weapons. But since the Conqueror's Relic was associated with the consequences of people, when activated, it was an extremely high and chaotic relic, and if they started using it all the time, the place would descend into chaos. Joo-hyun asks what all that noise was, as he thought the CEO didn't want the existence of relics to be discovered. The president says that it just meant he had to deal with more people afterward, and now was time to obey in silence. Then a voice appears, telling them to stop talking at once because that was a dangerous place, and if they didn't want to use their powers to awaken powerful beings, they should stop that. Observing the relic, he thinks it had a very powerful aura and should be a very high-ranking one. The protagonist thinks something was wrong about that, thinking that Dog Jackal was called the god of death from Egyptian mythology, which would mean that place was a tomb containing his relic. The president says that indeed it was wonderful, because once he was done with him, he would take the relic for himself. Again, that voice says they were very naive. At that moment, the building begins to shake, and several system screens start to appear in front of the boy because an abnormal amount of Egyptian auras was entering his body, and due to their strength, his relic started taking damage. At that moment, the catastrophe had begun. The scene he witnessed was definitely the great catastrophe that signaled the beginning of a chaotic era filled with relics. The airport was split in half by ancient Egyptian structures that emerged from the ground, and it was definitely the tomb of Anubis' relic. Thus, the world itself was turning into a giant tomb. The great catastrophe in general was when giant tombs began to appear, affecting the whole world in various places. The system alerts that Egyptian tombs have started appearing everywhere. Thoughtful, the protagonist wonders what he should do. Park asks what was happening, and the protagonist says it was nothing serious, as they were trapped inside a very dangerous tomb. And as they could see, all had happened because that old man couldn't stop showing off his power. However, the president says that never happened when he used his relics. Joo-hyun mentions that if they want to get out of that place, since it was a tomb, they just need to close it, and after closing, it should disappear. However, closing that place wouldn't be easy. In his past life, it took 3 months to finish a tomb created by the Great Catastrophe, saying that anyway, it was good to start at the heart of the tomb, asking them to follow him because they would conquer the supposed master of that tomb. However, the president asked them to wait, stating he never said he would go with them. Then the boy says he would give her some advice, and Set says he will never pass his trial. The young man wonders if this is going to be some sort of test. Next, he finds himself standing on a scale. It was the scale of judgment, where the relic would begin its trial. Joo-hyun thinks that if he passes the test, he will defeat it. Since his aura didn't affect the boy, it only created an opportunity for him to seize it. In his past life, the protagonist met the original user of the Anubis relic, and that person had given him the information that the item would ask several questions, but he only needed to answer no. He couldn't remember the questions, but if they were easy enough for a child to answer correctly, then there was no need to worry. The relic says that all the jurors have arrived and will now ask 42 questions, and if he can answer no to all of them, he will pass the test, but if he lies on any of them, the monster will see through his lie and devour him. The first question was if the boy had ever committed theft. The young man thinks his life was based on theft. Then he says he didn't understand the question, and the relic decides to ask the second question. But the young man had also committed that sin. Anubis begins asking his questions, and Juhyun finally understands that the child answered the questions easily because they hadn't lived long enough to commit all those sins. The relic says that the boy will not be able to answer no to even one of the 42 questions. Then it grabs him, saying that was expected of a human who lives surrounded by sin, because his heart was heavier than iron and his place was in hell. A giant serpent is above the protagonist, who desperately asks for more time to answer. But the relic throws him to the monster, which ends up swallowing Juhyun. Inside the serpent's stomach, souls surround the young man. To defend himself, he grabs a bone from the ground. The souls advance, but the boy manages to fight them off. Juhyun wonders if this will be his end, and a voice says that the humans seem to need help and that he was indeed foolish. The crow appears in the monster's stomach and says it had been a long time since his last meeting with the boy. Juhyun asks if this wasn't the past. The bird responds that the timeline didn't matter because it was unique. Then Juhyun notices the souls have returned, and the crow says it will help him get out of there. The boy asks what the bird was and why it was helping him, but before it can answer, the bird activates its powers. Outside, Osiris says it's taking longer than expected. However, the Judgment Space starts being forcibly destroyed. The relic can't believe that a mere human could do that. The Judgment Space is destroyed. Osiris realizes that this was the power of a god. Juhyun and the crow come out of the sphere, and Anubis had been defeated. The relic says it was sure the crow was sealed and questions how it had been released, adding that it still remembered when it sided with humans to destroy its brothers and absorb their powers. Juhyun asks if that was true, but the bird remains silent. The relic says it has no choice and will end everything now that the situation is like this. It then activates its ability, and the dead return. The crow says that this time it wouldn't be just from that space because souls would rise worldwide, and that it wouldn't be able to help him anymore. It then asks if a human was afraid, because now that everyone had fled, there was no escaping that tomb. Juhyun responds that unlike before, now he could use his relics, and he knew the true forms of the relics were around since they were objects that couldn't move. Immediately after, with his sword, he charges toward the dead, slashing many of them. And the items that were the true forms of the relics appear, but the army of creatures seemed endless. Next, the dead are wrapped in cloths, now looking like mummies. One of the monsters tries to strike the boy, but he manages to dodge the attack and tries to strike the dead in return. However, it has no effect. Juhyun says it's fine because he had another dagger. The relic says it feels Anubis nearby, and the boy tells it to take him to him. Now that the creatures were larger, the relics were more comfortable, and although they didn't know why, the crow's relic was free. The boy interrupts the conversation and cuts down one of the dead, eventually destroying one of the relics. Then Osiris is also destroyed, leaving only Anubis' relic. Juhyun asks it to open the trial again because he thought the results of the last one were wrong. Anubis says he has never conducted 2 trials on a single human, and even if he opens the trial, the human will never pass. The boy, in turn, guarantees that this will never happen, and that the relic will have to change the questions unless it wants to be shattered into pieces. Anubis' relic had no choice but to reopen the trial. Both the scales and the 42 jurors reappeared. Stet says he will ask the first question, but the boy grabs the relic by the neck, saying that it will ask the questions he commands, and the first is whether it has ever stolen from others. The relic questions what the purpose of the trial is if the questions are like this. Juhyun responds that this is not a trial of the afterlife, and that it should repeat what he says if it doesn't want to die. If it doesn't obey, he will break it into pieces. Set questions whether it matters if he is broken into pieces, and the boy in turn says he will control it, but if that doesn't work, he will destroy it. The relic falls silent. Then it asks if the young man has ever committed theft, but he kicks it, saying it should show respect to humans. And then the relic refers to the boy as Sir. Soon after, Juhyun wonders what he should ask next. The boy answered yes to all the questions, changing them to be favorable to him. The panel appears again to announce that the protagonist has completed the mission and that one of the 3 relics of the tomb has surrendered to him. To obtaining a divine rank relic, messages appeared saying that various things had leveled up. Immediately afterward, Juhyun orders the relic to close the tomb, and the structure starts to collapse. The man thinks about how skilled this young man is and that he wasn't easy to get rid of. Then the man approaches and says he hadn't recognized the protagonist's abilities and that he would like to work with him because the relics would change the world, and having someone like the young man in the new world would have great potential. As the president of TKBM, he would promise all the support. But Juhyun draws his sword and asks the man if making that request didn't show his cruel intentions, because he would invest in the boy and then discard him as if he were nobody. All he wants is to use him. The man says he was just commenting and that, at that moment, he had more than the young man, so it might seem like he would be working, and he questions what the problem is with expecting results from an investment. Then he asks the boy to think about the offer because it would be dangerous to collect all those relics without help. However, Juhyun interrupts the man's offers and slashes his neck, thinking he couldn't keep listening to that nonsense, since he still remembered when a relic fell into his hands and he had treated the boy like a slave, using his illness as bait. However, the blood returns to the man's body. The cut was immediately healed due to the power of the healing relics he possessed. That item was presumed to be of divine rank. Achilles is a soldier from Greek mythology. His mother wanted her son to be immortal like her, so she dipped his body in the river Styx, holding him by the heel. Achilles obtained a strong and resilient body, but his heel remained his weakness. Joo-hyun thinks that since Achilles died after being struck in the heel with an arrow, the relic's weakness was probably the same. But the problem is he doesn't know where this weakness is because the man's neck had returned to normal even after being cut. The man says he understands that the boy is good, but he cannot defeat him, and he doesn't want to fight. He was just trying to be an ally. Joo-hyun smiles and asks Muramasa to gather all its strength. Then he asks the man if he has ever heard the word revolt because that's what will happen, and they will not agree to be by his side. It should just think that it's because they didn't like his face. Muramasa was the perfect weapon for the situation because it becomes stronger the higher the rank of the opponent. Joo-hyun says to see if the man will shut up after he attacks with all the sword's power. Then he moves forward and slashes his belly. The boy struck him with all of Muramasa's power, producing multiple levels of power beyond those of the relic. Originally, yes, but the item would end up breaking, and he saw that as reckless. However, he couldn't leave his enemy alone. Feeling threatened, the man's relic activated on its own. If he stepped within range, he would also be in danger. He could reflect some of the impact of the Code of Hammurabi. This caused even more damage. But the Hammurabi relic was also damaged. The man's relics suffered enormous damage, and he wouldn't be able to do anything for a while. As a result, Muramasa was completely broken, and the Hammurabi relic also took damage. Joo-hyun says that doing all that and still not being able to kill the man was very frustrating. Then the protagonist's friend shows up, asking what happened, and why there was a dead man, but Joo-hyun replies that he wasn't dead. Right after, he says to leave the old man there, and that they should find a restaurant because he was hungry. On the news, they were receiving reports from people who saw monsters. According to the civilians, mummies emerged from the ground and some people used superpowers with strange objects. While watching, Joo-hyun says that now the whole world would know what relics were, and his friend asks what relics are. The boy replies that they were the things he left on the bed, and that he had said the world would change completely. The people who possess good relics will take power from now on. But the boy's items were broken. As a solution to this, he says he has some friends who can fix it. Then he calls a girl named Irene because he found a way to break her curse. On the other end of the line, the girl asks if that was true, and Joo-hyun says no, but also that it wasn't completely false. Even knowing this, he answers yes to Irene and that she just needs to find a person for him. The girl gets excited and asks who the person is. And the boy, in turn, smiles and replies that it's Yujaha, a specialist in relic restoration. Any relic can be destroyed due to its durability, and there was no way to recover them after they were destroyed. However, some relics have the power to restore others, and the people who possessed these items were called relic restorers. Yujaha was among the elite of these restorers. He basically monopolized the market and was known as the king of fraud. Eventually, he caught CEO Kwan's attention, and they were in the same tomb robbing group. Joo-hyun thinks he has to make him work for him because restoring relics would no longer be a problem. His friend asks if the boy wasn't the best when it came to relics, and then he replies that restoring items was a tricky task. Most restoration relics were on the artistic side, and they required extremely high affinity, so if he couldn't do it, someone else would have to. Soon after, a helicopter lands near them, and Iron gets off apologizing for being late. Joo-hyun, in turn, says to talk somewhere else. In an establishment, the boy says the girl would have to find a Korean named Yujaha. The girl says she had never heard of that name. The protagonist says she might not know him because he was using a false identity and asks if she knew anyone who collected art pieces. Iron mentions that her brother was a collector. He even met people who had the same taste. Then the boy shows a photo of Yujaha and asks her if her brother knew someone who looked like that. The girl is surprised after seeing the photo, and Joo-hyun asks if she knew the boy. She replies that Yujaha had tricked her brother a month ago, and that she saw him when she visited her parents' house. She was surprised when she found out he had tricked her brother. Her brother had bought an art piece from him that turned out to be fake, and 20 people ended up buying the same piece as him. The protagonist thinks he was already swindling people before. Then Iron says she thought she wouldn't be able to find him because she heard he had died. He was caught trying to scam her brother's friends and decided to flee in a car. However, his vehicle fell off a cliff, and even the police had said he was dead. Joo-hyun thinks it doesn't make any sense. He should be 26 now, and 5 years would have to pass before he met him, so this death didn't make sense. Then he wonders if the future had changed, because not everything happened the way it did before. The last time he died, the relic that caused the appearance of the Great Tomb was Indian, but this time it was Egyptian. Events were not happening the same way as in the past. However, Joo-hyun says that they will still try to find him, because he was tough, and they had to keep hope alive. On the news, it is mentioned that the anomaly that occurred worldwide had characteristics similar to the tombs that started appearing recently. In the hospital room, President Kwan asks if they weren't going to talk about this matter, because he had worked so hard to keep the relics a secret, and now everything was in vain because of Joo-hyun. He then gets angry because his body wasn't healing so he could kill the boy. A man enters the room laughing and asks what had happened, and that the president didn't look very well. Right after, he orders the security guard watching over the man to leave the room. Edward sits down and says that Quan has been quite active in recent days because he had even summoned a tomb of that size. And the man in turn responds that he didn't know there was a tomb at the airport. But the man says that it doesn't matter now because it doesn't change the fact that everything happened after Quan activated his relic, and that he should stay inactive for a while because his clients were angry. The man asks if everyone already knew about it. Edward says that he himself had given them that information, and the president asks why he would tell them that. The man replies that he wasn't just an arms dealer, but also an information seller, and that he needed to provide accurate information to earn trust. And that if Quan made a mistake, his job was to fix it. Then he asks why the man wasn't healing. The president in turn says that the relic probably suffered some damage, and that was all because of Ju Hyun. Edward says the boy seems interesting because he managed to damage an immortality relic. The broken relic was the man's problem, so he would have to fix it himself. And Quan asks if there was a way. The man says he will pass on the contact of a relic restorer. Then he says goodbye to the president. In the corridor, he tells his guard to research Ju Hyun. Yu Jaha receives a call from Edward. Upon answering, the man is surprised by the boy answering so quickly, and says that this means the young man needed money. Yu Jaha says he got caught while forging art, so he was pretending to be dead. He couldn't go out, and it was driving him crazy. Then he asks if the man called to talk about work. Edward says he needed a relic restoration, and the boy says he didn't like that kind of work because it was too tiring. The man says the one who asked was the president of TKBM. Yu Jaha gets excited because he wouldn't have to worry about getting paid. Then he accepts the job. Ju Hyun and Park arrive at the location Iron mentioned. Upon entering, the receptionist welcomes them, and they ask her if Yu Jaha was there. But the woman says the CDO wasn't in the office. Ju Hyun thinks about how he could sense him, and also a relic. Park gets irritated and asks if the boy really wasn't there. The protagonist pulls his ear and asks what he was doing, because they were there to lure Yu Jaha out. The woman says she didn't know why they were there, but they couldn't act that way, and that their president had passed away in a car accident. Then the boy throws a suitcase on the table, and says that since Yu Jaha passed away, what should he do with all that? The secretary looks at the bag and is surprised, because there were several relics, and some seem to be of a high rank. That's what Ju Hyun believed the lady thought. Then he asks if the woman knew what those things were. They were very valuable, but they were broken. It didn't need to be the president, but he needed someone to restore them. And since she worked for Yu Jaha, she must be very skilled, and asks if she couldn't fix the relics. The lady gets nervous and says she needed to go to the bathroom. The protagonist knew she would do that because she was as greedy as her boss. The lady calls the president to inform him about the relics, and that someone had come to ask the boy to restore the items. Yu Jaha asks her to send them away because he was negotiating with TKBM, and that would keep him busy for a long time. But the lady mentions that the boy brought over 10 relics, and some seem to be of divine rank. Then she asks what she should do. The young man says he will consider that extra money, and asks the woman to take the relics to the restoration room because he would make perfect forgeries and swap them with the real ones. Then the secretary returns and apologizes for the delay, and says she will restore the items for the young man. She then asks if she could take the relics to a room to check if they were in the right condition. Ju Hyun says that it's okay. Park mentions that all the relics were there and questions what they would do if she took everything and ran away with them. The boy replies that it was a good bait to catch a big fish, but his friend points out that he wouldn't be able to handle things now that he had given everything away. But the protagonist says to consider it a gamble to see if they would be lucky, or in the worst case, have some sort of bad luck. The boy says that they really won the lottery that time. That's why it was good that the girl called him, as some of them seemed to be of high rank, and the woman says she was sure they shouldn't be caught. However, the boy was not worried, saying she could just watch as he made a fake relic in a matter of seconds. It would be very easy because he gets something in his hands, the secret signature of a forger who had changed the world. There is a rank B relic of the Esper type, and that relic must be the one the girl had. So he would make a copy of that axe using them and steal the real relics. If he simply swapped the relics while holding the secret signature, he could make a perfect forgery. And that relic can not only copy the form, but also some of its functions. The forgery relic produces this using its own aura, which prevents anyone from noticing the difference for 12 hours. Looking at a piece of paper, Park asks what the hell that was because relic restoration is usually not that expensive, mentioning that it's 10 billion won for a little scratch, and that's a lot of theft. However, to the protagonist, that didn't matter because he was going to pay anyway. Right after that, the girl from before appears, showing the previous relic, mentioning that they were very damaged, so she thought she couldn't fix them. Moreover, that other one was on the verge of being destroyed. Observing the girl, Diorian seems to sense her bad intentions and throws the bag away, asking what kind of nonsense that was because that woman dared to swap his relics for fake ones, asking what he should do with her. Desperate, the girl says the real relics were in that room, saying she swore the idea wasn't hers and that she should spare her life. Meanwhile, the boy was listening to everything from behind the door. Within seconds, Diorian opens it, knocking the boy to the ground. Quickly, the protagonist orders the rope to tie him up. Irritated, the boy asks the protagonist to release him, but the protagonist doesn't care, asking where his relics were. The boy says he could put them in his safe, so they should take him out of those ropes. Heading toward the safe, Diorian says he would get his things first. Surprised, the boy asks how the boy knew his password if he did that on purpose. However, for Diorian, it didn't matter because it was the boy who made the mistake of doing that to him. Thinking that anyway, that boy was already completely wrong. However, he used to be different. He lived a normal life as a skilled artist. Not only normal, he went to a renowned school in the United States to do his paintings. However, he lost the artistic style he developed after investing so much time and effort in drawing to none other than his tutor, whose name was Richard, who became a world-famous artist using the stolen artistic style. Protesting made no difference to the boy, and since he wasn't known like his tutor at the time, he ended up losing his career and everyone thought he was just being jealous. So he changed since then, starting to use his talent to deceive other people. Thus, that forgery relic ended up approaching him, which helped him a lot to become that fraudster. Thinking he could have had a real conversation with him if he weren't so screwed up. Wondering if he could persuade him if he were in that state. Showing the object, the protagonist asks if he knew what relic that was. Because its name was Shakespeare's pen, it would make anything written with it come true. Threatening to kill the boy by writing his death on that paper. Irritated, the boy tries to break free from the ropes, asking if the protagonist was crazy. Apologizing, he says he wouldn't charge anything for the repairs and would do whatever he wanted, begging to be released from those ropes. Ju-hyun, in turn, asks the boy to make a deal with him, and then he would let him live. Looking at the deal, the man is completely shaken, mentioning that it would make him his slave. However, for the protagonist, it was more qualified as an exclusivity contract. The boy says he can't take any other orders except from the protagonist, and his word had nothing to do with it. Juki even asks him to calm down and read the contract to the end, as it wasn't that bad because the additional contract fee was 6 million. Also, he would give an extra every time he restored a relic. So he would provide food, clothing, shelter, comfort, and safety as long as the agreement was in effect. And whatever happened, the protagonist would take care of him from now on, asking where else in the world he could find a deal like that. Irritated, the boy asks if he even had the strength and skill to fulfill all that because he wasn't sure if he was really telling the truth. Trying to run away, he says it wasn't worth it. The protagonist then asks his team to go after the boy. However, they shouldn't be rough with him, thinking that even if he had caught him with a contract, he still had to win his heart, as using force to dominate him has its limits. This way, he would be able to obtain a divine rank relic in the future. While running away, the boy seems to call the former president, asking if he had heard of him, and the president says he didn't know he would call so soon. The boy says he heard the president wanted him to restore a relic, and he would do it right away. In a hospital, the president asks his henchmen to turn off the TV, feeling happy because it had been a long time since something had gone right in his life, saying they would sort out the details of that deal. While he was on the call, the protagonist's team ends up catching the boy, and the protagonist asks them to hand over his phone. Realizing it was the president, the protagonist is surprised because it seemed even he needed to repair some relics. However, it was a pity because that boy was now his personal restorer, so he should have fun while looking for another one. Hearing what the protagonist said, the boy becomes completely nervous. Irritated, the other boy asks what was wrong with the protagonist, and the protagonist says he should be the one asking that, asking if he wanted to side with that president and if he was really an idiot. So he should choose carefully what he wanted because the only thing he could expect from following the director was death. Therefore, the protagonist was the only person who would want to stay by his side. Still irritated, the boy asks why he should work for a random guy since he had just destroyed his office and made a huge mess. Ju-hyun thinks he was very annoying because it seemed he would have to persuade him another way. Asking him to sit down, Ju-hyun says they should have a proper conversation, mentioning that his name was Ju-hyun and that he was from the city of Seoul. Also, he was the head of a new excavation group and was planning to offer him the position of restorer. The boy asks if his introduction would change the situation, and the protagonist asks if he was really paying attention. But if he didn't want to, he could do it for him. Taking a piece of paper, he notices that the boy's name was Jae-ha, an art student who studied abroad and was a fantastic artist with a great passion for art. But now he's part of the scum deceiving people with fake paintings. So he didn't need to hide because that news had already spread everywhere. Also, he was even copying the style of the arts and something much bigger identical to a famous artist named Richard. Quickly, the boy charges at the protagonist, saying he didn't know what true art was because that damn man had copied him. Stopping the boy's punch, the protagonist asks if it really was Richard who copied him because art isn't something you can simply copy and paste. The boy says that was why he didn't last long while forging paintings, but that man had even copied what he was thinking. So it was impossible because it was like he had read his entire mind. However, for the protagonist, it was possible, mentioning he should already know that he used a relic before, and if he used one, that was certainly possible. So he was probably a relic user because its power was to turn a person into whatever they wanted, thus being able to copy knowledge and skills perfectly. Jae asks if he was really sure about that, and the boy says he basically had a lot of knowledge about relics. So he would help him recover the art and reputation that Richard had stolen from him. But in return, he should work only for the protagonist, asking if that wasn't a good deal. The The boy seems to be thinking about the protagonist's proposal, asking to wait a bit because he needed more time to think about it. Handing the phone to the boy, Ju-hyun says he could do whatever he wanted, because he didn't like being compared to that old man, but he respected his opinion. Then he apparently hands a relic to the boy, mentioning that it would protect him and that if he were to work for him, he couldn't let him get hurt. After some time, that boy from before was at the president's reception, mentioning that it was very good to see him in person. He asked if there were any conditions for working. Quickly, the boy asked if the president knew a man named Richard. The president immediately replied that Richard was a world-famous artist, known for being much more than a genius. He then asked what the boy had to do with him. The boy said that Richard had taken everything from him. He used a relic to copy exactly what he did, building his current reputation. He asked the president to please expose Richard, promising to sign the contract with him if he did. However, the man started laughing in the boy's face. He said it was very interesting, but unfortunately, it seemed the boy had chosen the wrong person. He made a call and seemed to be speaking with Richard, mentioning he had just heard a very interesting story. The reason why the protagonist let the boy go was because he knew the contract would never be signed. That old man was very close to Richard. Moreover, he was a crucial member of Pandora, which would emerge in the future. Richard then said that he had told the boy to pretend to be dead if he didn't want to be killed for real. He asked if the humiliation hadn't been enough already. However, the president asked him to calm down, saying he would handle everything. Hanging up the call, the president said he had a strong friendship with Richard. Irritated, the boy began to leave, saying he hadn't known that and that they should forget about what happened. However, the president wouldn't let him leave, asking when he had given him permission to exit the room. Quickly, one of his henchmen grabbed the poor boy. The CEO asked them to make sure they didn't break anything on him because he had a lot of work to do. While on the ground, the boy said this was kidnapping. He quickly remembered the relic the protagonist had given him, but when he tried to use it, it had no effect. Then the protagonist appeared when he least expected it, and this time would tell the world with certainty that the boy would stay by his side, which was the plan's objective. Besides, the plan had been so successful that it seemed the boy had even ended up falling for the protagonist. Desperate, the boy asked what was going on. Ju-hyun said it was a rescue operation and asked the boy to get up right away. Irritated, the president realized that the protagonist had appeared again. However, he said he wasn't there to cause trouble, he was just there to take his friend. When asked if he wanted to fight with all of his relics completely broken, the president quickly ordered his henchmen to finish him off. Grabbing the pen, the protagonist said they left him no choice. Writing on the paper with his relic, he said that the guards who went after the boy were about to suffer great pain before dying. A while later, the two were already in the protagonist's apartment, and the boy asked what Ju-hyun wanted from him. The protagonist said he wanted him to repair his relics, so he would be the repairer for his tomb raiding group. However, to the boy, the protagonist had never said he was from an excavation group, but Ju-hyun had lied to convince him, so he chose a more normal word to describe what it was. Irritated, the boy said he was a liar, but the protagonist asked him not to call him that, requesting he be addressed as leader and with respect. However, the boy didn't like that at all. Punching the boy, the protagonist told him to shut up and get to work immediately. He wanted all those relics repaired in less than 3 days. However, the boy said that wasn't possible. He couldn't repair them all in just 3 days. He needed at least a month for each relic. Surprised, Ju-hyun asked if the relics took that long to repair, and the boy said yes, asking if he didn't know how complex that work was. Besides, all of his relics were in horrible condition, and in his case, even a year wouldn't be enough to repair them all. But to the protagonist, the boy was lying too much. He asked if he felt no guilt about that because it seemed he was planning to work once a week, so he would prove to the boy that it was possible to repair relics quickly. Curious, the boy asked how he would prove that, and the protagonist said he would show him because he should just lend him the repair relic. But having the relic didn't mean repairs would be fast, yet he should try anyway. Looking at the brush, the protagonist thinks that if he uses it, it might consume a lot of energy. The boy says that if the protagonist fails, he should give him a month for each relic. Ju-hyun asks what would happen if he succeeds, and the boy replies that he would put his salary on the line. Convinced, the protagonist says he shouldn't make such bets so easily. A while later, that boy seems surprised by what he saw. He asks what kind of monstrosity that was because the protagonist was good even at repairing relics. With the relic completely fixed, the boy ends up losing his bet. He questions why the protagonist is so good at it since he can do everything on his own. Handing over the relic, Ju-hyun asks him to take a closer look because repair relics, and he got along very well, and he could get along well with it if he had a high socialization ability. The boy mentions that its durability has really dropped a lot even after just one use. But still, he couldn't work as fast as the protagonist, so he didn't think he would be the repairer he wanted. Ju-hyun tells him to stop complaining and get to work quickly because he would improve as time passed. And anyway, the person who hired him wasn't him, but who he would become. So he should work hard because he would get better, and he guaranteed it. Sitting in the chair, the boy is thoughtful, wondering if the protagonist was a fortune teller by any chance. Soon after, the boy ends up receiving a call from someone. Meanwhile, the protagonist asks if the plant was okay, and the man says it had calmed down a bit. Shortly after, a system screen appears to Ju-hyun, informing him that his craftsman ability has increased to level 3. In addition, he earned a new title and another new skill called Tomb Restoration. The protagonist says that tombs collapse when you capture a relic, questioning what he would do with an empty tomb after restoring it. Soon after, a man appears, showing a call from an acquaintance who had insisted on passing on the phone. Answering the call, Ju Hyun seems to recognize that voice. Surprised, the boy asks if they knew each other. And that voice says that the protagonist was a man who received the title of King of the Rich. Furthermore, he was a great Englishman and a major investor in the relic market, who was probably already acting as a mediator between relic users and the market. The man, realizing that the protagonist knew him, is surprised because things were getting more and more interesting. So that man was going to give him very important information, but most of the time, with information came a lot of spilled blood. That's what they told him about a boy skilled enough to mess with the president. So naturally, he became interested. Therefore, he would recommend him for a new job, asking what the protagonist thought about it. Ju Hyun quickly asks him to continue talking, but the old man asks him to calm down because the information alone still had a high price. However, for Ju Hyun, that didn't matter because how would he decide if he didn't know what it was about? Quickly, the old man says he will explain in detail because a bounty was placed on a tomb in China, and if his excavation group joined, they would give him a part of the reward. However, the condition was that any relics found would go to the Chinese government, so he needed the protagonist's group to steal those relics. He asked what he thought about it, and if everything went well, he would consider giving him a VIP position. But for the boy, he wouldn't consider it and would indeed immediately offer a position. He questions who made that request, ordering him to tell all the details. So you shouldn't underestimate him because he knew a lot of things, and that old man wouldn't mess with the Chinese government just because he wanted a few relics. That meant someone had asked for it, questioning who was the person who wanted such chaos. Realizing that the protagonist was not an ordinary boy, the old man thinks he will tell him the details. That was a request from a man named Kira Clark, a general in the US Army responsible for all relic-related missions, a frightening woman who received the title Queen of War. However, the protagonist thinks he doesn't want to get involved with a woman so soon, nor does he want to help her. Continuing to speak, the old man says she was collecting geographical-type relics, and apparently the relic from that tomb was of that type. And even for the Queen of War, who metabolized geographical relics, such a relic would be of good use to her. After detailing everything, the old man asks what the protagonist plans to do. However, the boy simply smiles, accepting the unexpected offer. While the protagonist is on a plane, that boy from before says that it's ridiculous, questioning why they're already heading out since they had just accepted the job. Moreover, they had boarded a plane as soon as he had hung up his phone. But the protagonist just orders him to repair the relics since he has so much time to talk. Then Irene appears, saying she hopes the seats are comfortable, and the protagonist is surprised that she's there with them because thanks to her, they could secure a spot so easily. Observing Irene, the boy thinks she's very beautiful and that he's seen her somewhere before. Quickly, Ju Hyun tells him to greet her since they had borrowed her jet for the trip. Calling the boy a scammer, Ju Hyun asks if he's ever heard the name Irene Hilton because that's the girl. And if he has anything against her, it's better to say so now since he'll be seeing her a lot from now on. With tears in his eyes, the boy asks for forgiveness for his mistakes, begging not to be handed over to his father. Whispering in Irene's ear, the protagonist asks her to threaten the boy a little since he was quite lazy and wanted a whole month to prepare just one relic. Even though the protagonist had put him to work, all he thought about was slacking off. Irene says the protagonist is an important business partner for her, so he needs to work hard if he wants her to keep quiet and not tell her brother. Quickly, the boy accepts the offer. Ju Hyun asks her not to be too strict because the boy would also help solve her problem. From now on, he should learn how to use relics since his relic is a parasitic type that lives inside his body, meaning they wouldn't be able to remove it completely. So the best thing to do would be to learn how to use and manipulate it. That's why they're looking for a definitive solution, but for now, they could try to do everything possible. Using dominance and the boy's socialization ability to control the relics, he needs to learn both methods little by little. Even though it's difficult to suppress his relic because of its power, they're trying to minimize those problems. Sometime later, the protagonist arrives in a city called Macau. 2/3 of that city had already turned into a tomb, so the next entrance is the city of Taipa. And the bridge leading to that island was compromised, so it's a matter of the relic. The only way is by boat. The only problem is whether that relic might have some connection to boats. Desperate, the boy calls out to Ju Hyun, mentioning that his relic had disappeared. Then the system warns that a thief is after his relics. Quickly, the boy feels something passing through his torso. The protagonist, in turn, is surprised because 3 of his relics had been stolen. However, he had left the most useful one behind, ordering that rope to tie up the thief. The boy asks if the protagonist has already stolen enough relics, and the protagonist says that unless one can teleport, they won't be able to escape that rope. Noticing that the rope hasn't returned, he says they should see if they caught the thief. Then he and the boy seem to enter a women's restroom. Entering the place, they find a woman completely tied up. The other boy asks if the protagonist happens to know this girl. The young man says she was using Medusa's relic and worked for the American government. Surprised by what the protagonist had seen, the boy asks if they wouldn't turn to stone if they looked into her eyes, but the young man says he doesn't need to be afraid. The young man, observing the girl, wonders what's wrong with her. With a snap of his fingers, the protagonist ties her up even more, saying it's no use. Before being cursed, Medusa was known for having beautiful hair, questioning how he would explain Medusa's beauty with that little girl. Because if she wanted to fully utilize Medusa's relic, she'd at least have to be a complete adult. But even though she's a child, he won't go easy on her. Because it doesn't matter if she's just a little girl, a relic user is the same either way. And if she tries any tricks, she'll suffer the worst. Observing the situation, the boy thinks the protagonist is very cruel, and for some reason, they seem to be the villains in the situation. Then Ju-hyun removes the rope from the girl's mouth, asking if she didn't come alone, and the girl responds that many people were helping her. Because many people from her school had helped, and the protagonist thinks there were at least 20 people. Shortly after, the boy says it seems like there's an entire excavation group in that place. But the United States left Edward in charge of all that, questioning why they hadn't been contacted. Ju-hyun says they were making sure the relic would go to the United States, since they knew how big the Chinese excavation group was. Considering how obsessed that woman was with relics, this one in particular should be extremely useful. That's why it would be worth stealing it. But obviously, the boy would have to make a fake copy. However, the boy didn't want to do that because deceiving the United States wasn't a very nice thing. Yet Ju-hyun didn't care about that, since the first page of the contract stated that he had to do everything the king ordered without questioning anything. Anyway, he should thank that girl for the information, mentioning that he would seal her mouth because he didn't want her talking about them everywhere. However, the boy interrupts by saying he hadn't repaired that relic yet. This leaves the protagonist completely irritated with what he heard. With no other choice, Ju-hyun says that if she gave the relics to her friends, she would suffer immense pain, and the same would apply when she used that relic. Leaving the place, the protagonist asks his henchmen to capture all the relics that little girl had because they couldn't waste time. While they were walking, Jaeha asks why they were going to the tomb at that exact moment since they didn't have many relics repaired yet. But Ju-hyun replies that he had clearly told him to repair them quickly, and since they knew the excavation group was there, they had to hurry. That's why it was better to have the stolen relic right in front of them, and somehow he would handle it. Meanwhile, in a room, a man was completely furious because that girl had lost all her relics. Another woman asked him to calm down because shouting would only make things worse. However, for the man, he should never have put a child in his group because all she did was ruin his plans. Lucy, on the other hand, said she hadn't ruined anything. Thomas mentions that she had lost all the relics, questioning what she thought about that. The girl replies she hadn't lost them, but they had been stolen. This leaves the man completely surprised by what he heard. The girl, in turn, gets nervous, remembering what the protagonist had told her. Quickly, Thomas asks who had done that to the girl, but Lucy says she had forgotten who it was. Another woman says the girl should tell the truth so they could repair all the damage, mentioning that she had said earlier she would help them. Accepting the offer, Lucy says that 2 men had stolen her relics. Then some magic seems to surround the girl. Falling to the ground, she suddenly begins to laugh, wondering if that was the unbearable pain the protagonist had mentioned. Meanwhile, near the entrance to Tepa Island, a group of ships was heading towards their destination. Jada says he didn't know anything else because they were really boarding that place without any relics. Ju-hyun says they should just take the relics they stole from Lucy because they would find something useful. However, looking inside his bag, there was nothing that really served. Then a voice seems to echo through the place, saying it would allow their entry, because they were already approaching that tomb. Then a man appears asking what the 2 of them were doing there because they were in a state of emergency. Nervously, Jaeha asks if they were in trouble. Ju-hyun says the man had said the ships were being attacked by monsters. Meanwhile, in the dead of night, a ship seems to be sailing across the seas. However, several creatures appear, attacking everyone on that ship. From another ship, a group of people watch the situation, thinking it was already over. Ju-hyun says there were fewer of those monsters than he thought and that they weren't that big, so he probably wouldn't use any relics. Right after, the other ship ends up hitting the other vessel. Watching the situation, the protagonist says the boats were losing stability. Looking ahead, he sees a group of people who were apparently possessed, and if they were bitten, they could end up being controlled. Desperate, Jaeha asks what they should do. Quickly, the 2 begin to flee from those men, and while those idiots take care of the monsters, Ju-hyun starts activating his relics, and since they were human, he would only need to use that relic. Soon after, the soldiers end up falling to the ground, and Jaeha, surprised, questions what was happening. Ju-hyun says they just needed to take care of the monsters now. While that voice echoed through the ship, the protagonist wonders why he felt it was talking to him. Then that relic mentions that the protagonist's name was spreading among all of them. Jaeha asks if the relics communicated with each other or something like that. And Ju-hyun says they were a bunch of attention seekers, so they even surpassed humans in that regard. The relic, apparently irritated, says he was a lower life form, questioning how he dared to call it that. But there was nothing to worry about because there was little time left until his death, as the relics would turn against his arrogance. However, for Ju-hyun, that was great because it would mean they were coming directly to him. And if they were really after him, they should have set some sort of trap, questioning if it shouldn't tell him more about it. About the raven that everyone talked about, he wanted to know what kind of person he was. The Egyptian relics also mentioned something about that raven, as he seemed to be quite famous among them. Irritated, the relic asks why it would have to tell that, saying he should think about it on his own. Understanding the situation, the protagonist says he thought the relics were smarter than humans, but this was very disappointing. Annoyed, the relic asks how the protagonist dares insult its intelligence. Then the boy tells it to prove it was true, making the relic even more irritated. Mentioning that the raven was a highly respected divine relic that could devour its enemies and take their powers for itself. An extremely powerful ally, but suddenly made a contract with a human, betraying all of them. Thus, countless relics were devoured by him and others became slaves to that human. Unable to stand by and watch that traitorous raven, they imprisoned him. Not expecting that answer, the protagonist thinks that this means the tomb he had entered before was the raven's prison, mentioning that he knew something was strange compared to normal tombs. But if that were the case, then it made sense that all his subordinates had been annihilated at that time. That's why he thought he would be able to devour all the divine relics, questioning how they managed to imprison that monster. The relic says that fighting head-on would be a difficult task, but they managed to deceive the human, because humans were simple when something better than the raven was shown to them. So he abandoned him without hesitation, and thanks to that, they sealed the raven and even killed that human, ordering the protagonist to bow before that supreme strategy. Ju Hyun says he didn't care about the strategy but managed to get good information. That's why he was wondering who that meddling raven was that wanted to ally with him. However, after hearing this, that could be a good job. But the relic says that if he sided with that raven, it would mean he would become the enemy of all relics. But Ju Hyun didn't care about that because he didn't plan to become friends with them. Annoyed with the situation, the relic tells the protagonist to just die. Then several monsters start emerging from the sea. While fighting those monsters, the protagonist says it never seemed to end. Moreover, they weren't even paying attention to the other people. They were only attacking them. But even with all that, it was still possible to defeat them. However, suddenly the protagonist's sword ends up cracking. He tells Jaeha to stop talking and run already because they didn't have any other relic they could fight with. That's why they should head to Bagamite. Entering that room, Jaeha asks what he was talking about because he didn't even know how they were still alive. Ju even mentions that that tomb was very difficult to conquer besides being huge and even controlling the sea, so it wouldn't be easy to get out of that place. And that's when that stupid relic got irritated and started creating giant waves, sending subordinates after them, and that's why they were still in a very bad situation. Even so, they didn't have any relics to get out of there. But at least the back of the ship was clear, so they could escape through that spot. So jumping to any boat, they would have to cross the sea and grab that relic. And the other boy asks how to steer a boat. Then another ship appears, calling the protagonist a thief, asking the other girl if it was those bastards who had stolen their relics. Surprised, the protagonist realizes it was that girl from before, which meant it was the former American excavation group, mentioning that he should let them approach that ship because they would end up having some pretty interesting things. That's why he would take care of them, asking the other boy to find a boat along with the rope. Approaching the protagonist, that man asks if it was he who had stolen their relics, because he would take them back, but the protagonist questions who said he could retrieve them, mentioning that his group seemed to have some useful things, questioning if they could stop with that. However, the boy says he would finish him off. In a matter of seconds, he launches an attack against the protagonist. Barely dodging the attack, Ju Hyun thinks he was very fast for his size. Delivering another attack, he thinks that his relic was probably rank A, ordering him to hand over his relics. However, when he throws the punch, it doesn't seem to have much effect. Quickly, the man starts attacking multiple times with his weapon towards the protagonist, thinking that even though it looked like a metal pipe, it seemed like an iron sword. So he was completely screwed if he got hit by one of those attacks, and it could definitely kill him. Grabbing his silver axe, Ju Hyun thinks it was better to avoid a direct fight. The man says it looks like he finally understood the gravity of the situation, but that it didn't change anything. Quickly, the protagonist charges at the man, delivering an attack with the axe, questioning if he really thought that, giving an order for the axe to take down any enemy that threatened his wealth. In a matter of seconds, the man's clothes end up disappearing. Ju Hyun says he should have dodged that, questioning why he tried to block. Now they would see the true form of his relic. The system announces it was the sword of Knight Furtherita, granted to the king by a brave lady. Observing the sword, Ju Hyun says it was very foolish and vigorous. Then Jaeha appears again with a boat. Irritated, the man asks the protagonist to return his sword. However, right after, several of those monsters had already invaded the ship. The protagonist was already stealthily escaping with that boat, telling the boy to go straight because he would show the way. That's why it was good that they had plenty of fuel. However, right behind them, that group was already chasing them again. Ju Hyun, using that rope relic, says they should try something else, grabbing the arm of that other woman, ordering the rope to throw her off the boat, mentioning that it was better to catch her quickly because that relic had spread the monsters through the water to capture her. Meanwhile, the girl was still drowning in the water. The other man says if they move the boat, the boy might end up escaping, but even so, the man orders them to go rescue her, saying the protagonist would pay for that. Observing the island, the protagonist says the relic was hidden right under that tree, so they were almost there. In front of that tree, the relic is surprised because it had indeed been found, and if he wanted to control it, he would have to offer himself as a sacrifice. so he should dispose of himself. Ju Hyun in turn asks what would happen if he didn't want to do that, leaving the tree completely surprised by what it had heard. Drawing his sword, the protagonist says it was time to consume that relic, saying that now the sword should show its true edge. Quickly, he strikes that tree, which was apparently a relic. Desperate, the tree can't believe what had happened because at that exact moment, it had been split in half. Ju Hyun, motionless, observed the situation, and the system announces that he had obtained a map of the Western treasures, a Ranka relic. Grabbing the relic, the protagonist shows it to Jaeha. That relic belonged to a man named Zheng He, who, with the map of Western treasures, sailed all over the West, conquering treasures, thus exploring the air of the Northeast under the command of the Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. With more than 60 fleets, he sailed to the west of Asia, passing through India and heading towards Africa, and historical texts said he returned with all kinds of treasures. It was clear it was an achievement, but they should repair the relic as quickly as possible, leaving the boy completely shaken because he would have to repair even more relics. Then the protagonist orders the relic to close that tomb because now the coup would begin. Sometime later, the protagonist was already in the urban district of Mecca, questioning how long it would take to make those fake relics, and Jaeha says he had just started, questioning if they would really deliver a fake relic to other people because that was very risky, and if it was really worth the risk, as they were pretty even, questioning why they didn't just hand over the relic already. Irene, also present there, says she also thought it was very risky because it was better not to make too many enemies. However, Ju Hyun says he was doing it because it was necessary and even more to solve her problem, asking the girl to place her hand on that relic. Touching the relic, the protagonist asks her to listen to him, ordering the map to mark every place related to the girl's misfortune. Surprised, Ju Hyun says that it was working. Then the map marks Turkey, indicating they would have to go there to solve her problem. And for this reason, they needed that map, and of course, they would also use it later for personal use. However, for Jaeha, even if they needed it, it didn't change the fact that the fake relic would disappear after some time, and they would surely get caught, because they were dealing with a woman named Kira Clark, who would chase them to the ends of the earth. Ju Hyun agrees, considering the fact that she would pursue them to the ends of the earth, because that woman was trying to motorize geographical relics and probably had some useful ones. This way, she would locate the tombs and conquer them completely. Moreover, he knew one more thing. Columbus's map would be the most problematic among her relics, because when it marks a place, it gives information about the tomb and the relic. A lot of tombs around the world were already in her hands, and one of them was in Turkey. And honestly, the protagonist didn't have much time to waste with those relics, but with Irene, it was another story. Because without a doubt, that woman would be eager for a strong relic like Irene's. But since it's a parasitic relic, she wouldn't be able to steal it directly, which meant she would do anything to get it. Even if it involved kidnapping or blackmail, she would have no limits to her plans, thinking that this might have really happened before she died. There was no other way for a person like Irene to become the goddess of destruction. Ju even asks her not to worry because he wouldn't let anyone lay a finger on her. That's why they needed to pull off that scheme, provoke her, and then lure her in. And apparently that woman was somewhere nearby, and when she found out that the relic she had obtained was fake, she would go crazy. And at that moment, he would explain everything. So she would probably meet the protagonist, at least to kill him. Jaeha asks what he planned to do after meeting her, and the protagonist says that he would destroy all her precious geographical relics, leaving Jaeha completely shaken by what he had said. But the protagonist tells him to just shut up, and if he had finished listening, he should get to work already, thinking that if he let the situation continue, they would eventually run into her again, so it was better he use this chance to resolve it once and for all. Meanwhile, at the CIA headquarters, a group of agents was discussing. One of them asked if they really hadn't found any relic in the closed tomb. Annoyed, a man replied that this meant someone had stolen the relic right under their noses. Moreover, two of their agents, Thomas and Linda, were captured by China. Another agent mentioned that they didn't expect the attack, and another said no one imagined such a skilled user would appear since there was no information about him. Irritated, the man blamed the headquarters for not having prepared properly. At that moment, another person entered the discussion. On the screen appeared a blue-haired man who questioned the tense atmosphere, asking them to cheer up. When addressed as a lady, it was revealed that he was actually a woman and an advanced AI. She commented that although they had failed, they managed to recover the relic by other means. However, she lamented that the famous one had failed in such an important mission. Even so, she had made a request to one of her colleagues and managed to complete the mission, ensuring that the exchange would soon take place. And she also ordered them to start investigating the mysterious skill user. Since he clearly posed a great threat, her interest in strong people was notable. Shortly after, Ju Hyun's group finished creating the fake relic and handed it over to Edward, who then passed it on to Kira. Unaware of the scheme, Kira accepted the exchange and did not raise any suspicions. Thanks to this, Ju Hyun was able to focus on repairing his own relics, including the map, which was completely restored. At the same time, he insisted that Irene continue practicing with her relic, even if it was painful to see her struggling like a novice. After delivering the relic, Edward paid generously, and they were finally able to enjoy a luxurious meal. During the meal, old Edward appeared furious, accusing Ju Hyun of having sold him a fake relic. He wanted to know what Ju Hyun had done, since Kira was now after him. Ju Hyun calmly questioned what had happened, claiming he delivered the geographical relic as requested. However, the old man was enraged, calling him a swindler. Ju Hyun explained that the relic simply disappeared, and to make matters worse, the Prime Minister of England and other people also mysteriously vanished. Surprised, Ju Hyun asked if they had used the relic incorrectly, but the old man replied that it was working perfectly until it disappeared. The problem now was that with the relic gone, Kira was in a devastating rage, and the old man feared for his own life. Nervous, the old man pressed Ju Hyun, asking what they were going to do in the face of this imminent catastrophe. Whispering in the protagonist's ear, Jae-ha questioned why he was laughing, considering that the Prime Minister of England had disappeared, and asked if that wasn't a bad thing. However, for Ju Hyun, this was a good opportunity. He mentioned that Kira was full of problems and desperate times are the best to triple the scams, asking Jae-ha to watch and learn, asking how long the situation would remain like that, and if the old man could contact Kira at that very moment because he needed to talk to her. However, the old man hesitated, fearing that calling her in that situation could make things worse. But that wasn't what the protagonist wanted, and what he planned to do could end up harming them even more. In the end, the old man ended up calling Kira, and as it seemed, had just been scolded. Handing the phone to the protagonist, the old man said it was an honor to speak with her. However, for Kira, that wasn't good, as she didn't know she would be speaking with him like this. She mentioned that she had heard he had messed with some of her men and taken her relic, and since the relic was delivered, she had many problems, asking if he could confirm that he was responsible for it. Ju Hyun replied that obviously, one could say it was him, but it wasn't very nice to be falsely accused because he simply took the relic and handed it over to Mr. Edward. Irritated, Kira said she would kill him if he was lying, so he should speak clearly, questioning what he had done with the relic. However, the protagonist said he had never done anything, mentioning that he wanted to help and that he was calling precisely because of that, because he had heard that the Prime Minister of England had disappeared, and that wasn't something he could ignore since it happened after the exchange with him. He emphasized that if neither she nor Edward wanted to do business with him anymore, that would be terrible for someone like him because he was the only one skilled in using relics. And if he lost all his business contacts, how would he put food on the table? Therefore, as an extra service, he was willing to help them in the hope of doing business with them in the future. Hearing the protagonist's offer, Kira became thoughtful, asking how he would help them since he was saying he would find the Prime Minister of England. Quickly, Ju Hyun replied that that was exactly it because he had heard that the old man possessed some geographical relics. Irritated, Kira asked if the old man had said that, and the protagonist said that he probably mentioned it unintentionally, asking her not to be mad at the guy. But anyway, he asked her to let him use those relics. However, Kira replied that she had already tried that and that none of the relics could help her. Ju Hyun replied that if she was using the relics normally, maybe it wouldn't work. But what he was trying to do was to bring out the hidden powers of those relics to locate the Prime Minister. He explained that many think that one can only use the powers the relic grants, but that wasn't correct because he could use those hidden powers. Hearing what the protagonist had said, the two around were surprised, questioning if that was really true. Surprised, Kira asked if he could really use the secret functions of the relics, questioning if that really existed. Ju Hyun affirmed that it was real, and that if he managed to awaken Shia and get the relic using the secret powers of the relics, he asked what she thought of that. Then Kira decided that she would let him use her relics, but only under her conditions. He would go where she sent him and could not bring any relic along, in addition to doing everything under the supervision of her men. Convinced, the protagonist said those conditions were acceptable. Surprised, the old man couldn't believe he had really convinced the general, but the protagonist said that was very easy. He asked the old man to stay there and rest because he needed to go alone, calling Jae-ha to go along with him and also needed to finish repairing the relics. The system announced that he had received a new title along with more information on his status, indestructible scammer, and also a tomb raider who pulls off scams in addition to excavating tombs. Observing his status increasing, the protagonist wonders if that raven was watching everything and why it needed to show it to them. Ju Hyun says that was nonsense and tells Jae-ha to get back to work while the old man could return to his house. Sometime later, that woman called Ju Hyun, informing him of the place where he should go, a hotel near the others he had seen before. She had also said not to bring any relics, but a soldier would not go to war without any weapons. So Ju Hyun decided to shrink all the useful relics and disguise them to take them with him. Since he was using domination to maintain their appearance, they were constantly draining his strength, so he needed to end this quickly. Looking around, Jae-ha commented that they were in a very fancy hotel. The protagonist agreed, saying that was true because they were dealing with someone of high status. Then a young woman appeared, asking how she could help them. Ju Hyun said it was okay because they were there to meet someone. Shortly after, two men in suits appeared, asking if he was Ju Hyun, and the protagonist replied that he was, asking them to show the way. Following the young man, they quickly reached the general's room. As she turned her head, the woman was revealed, welcoming the protagonist, mentioning that she didn't sense any relics with him, and that it seemed he could follow orders. Jae-ha whispered in the protagonist's ear that he had thought she was a general, questioning if it was really possible to become one at that age. However, for the protagonist, she could be using some kind of makeup. Right after, the woman asked him to follow her. Some time later, they arrived at a table. Observing the relics, Ju-hyun thought that was a map of Blackbeard's pirates, a rank B, another rank C, along with a rank A. He decided he would get rid of all of them from there. The woman in turn asked the protagonist to show his hidden power and warned that he had better work well or he'd end up with a bullet in his head. Ju-hyun asked her not to worry because he would need the pen. Handing it over, the woman said he had better not pull any tricks. With the pen in hand, the protagonist began writing something on that relic, pointing a gun at the young man's head. The other man asked what he was doing with the general's precious relic. But Ju-hyun explained that this was an important step in bringing out its secret powers. Then the woman asked the man to let Ju-hyun do whatever he wanted but said it had to be worth it. Convinced, the protagonist said she could trust him. The protagonist was questioned about what he was doing, and he replied that they were called tomb crickets. The woman asked how he could read that. Ju-hyun said it was luck, but thought he knew because in his past life, he used to have the archaeologist's relic, and the raven had probably done something now that the relic was no longer with him. Then he said he had finished writing his request, and that the relic would release his power. The young man thought that hidden powers or anything else were lies, and that the writings on the relic were not made to find the Prime Minister of England, because he already knew his location since he had used Zheng He's map, and the answer had already been determined. Right after, he said he had discovered where the Prime Minister was. He was in the Sahara Desert, and if the woman gave him a sheet, he could write down the coordinates. While noting them down, he warned that the minister could be on the move, so they should search the region. The young woman handed the notes to one of her soldiers and asked him to deliver them to special operations and also authorize the use of search relics. Then Ju-hyun talked about having done his part of the deal. However, the woman pointed a gun at his head and said he could only talk about that after the minister was rescued and safe. They would stay at that location until they found the man. Yujaeha asked if they would be able to find him. The woman in turn told the boy not to worry because her men were competent and would find him in a minute. Then she asked Ju-hyun to teach her about the language of relics, but the young man said it was a bargaining chip. But the woman questioned if he would want to negotiate without giving anything in return first. Seeing that he had no other choice, he said he would spell it out to make it easier. While smiling, he nodded at Yujaeha. The boy seemed to understand the plan. Right after, the protagonist started writing again. The general is informed that they had found Prime Minister Albert and that he was safe, with no risk to his life. Relieved, Ju-hyun says that since everything was resolved, he would leave, but the woman does not allow him to go. She states that she couldn't let someone with such skills leave like that and that he had to cooperate until they could learn his methods of using the relics. The protagonist asks what she would do if he refused. Immediately after, an explosion occurs. Surprised, the general wonders what happened and orders her men to remove the relics from the site because they were burning. However, the soldiers start tearing up the maps. Realizing what was happening, the general stops them by shooting their legs and says that it was clearly the work of the relic. The woman then asks where Ju-hyun was, accusing him of having planned this. Meanwhile, Ju-hyun and Jaeha manage to escape. Ju-hyun praises Yujaeha for being able to draw correctly in a short amount of time. Right after the bomb exploded, the protagonist had handed the escape relic to Jaeha, and he took advantage of the confusion to draw a way out. The relic they used was the same that President Kwan's lawyer carried. Although it was an inconvenient escape method, they now had hope since they had found someone who could draw well. Curious, Yujaeha asks what Ju-hyun had done. The protagonist explains that he had borrowed the pen, disguising it as another one, and swapped them. He also memorized some names so that he could apply the effect. Moments earlier, those men had met with the boys and Ju-hyun had commented that they should get to know each other better, but the agent told the boy to keep quiet. The young man in turn said he was not the enemy and that he would resolve the whole situation for them. In exchange, he asked them to go easy on him. Soon after, the men revealed their names and Ju-hyun wrote a command using a language on the relic they wouldn't understand, making them see an evil spirit on the map. They thought that if they didn't tear up the artifact, the general would be in danger. Then Ju-hyun comments that that woman would not be able to chase them, and what they could do now was head to Turkey. Meanwhile, in a call, the general orders a man to restore her relic as soon as he returns to the United States. The man mentions that several repair requests have appeared and that he had received a request from TKBM. Him comments that he thought the person who damaged her relics was the same one who damaged TKBM's and that he would still cause a headache if they just ignored this. However, the man tells the general not to worry because soon Pandora's box would be created. Meanwhile, in a seemingly peaceful scene, the cook tells Irene that her kebab is ready and the girl thanks him. She asks the man if something had happened, but he questions what she was talking about. Still, the girl runs off, saying it was nothing. In the center of Turkey, the girl walks, carrying her food, and soon after gets into her car. She tells Ju-hyun that practicing the use of relics during that time was worth it, and that nothing happened while she went to buy food. However, right after, a billboard falls onto the street. Ju-hyun comments that it was too early to be grateful, but it was better than before. He believes the girl had already mastered affinity and that from now on, she should focus on making more use of domination. Yujaeha observes that she still had much to learn, but the protagonist responds that she only needed the basics to prevent the relic from damaging her body since it is a parasitic type. If it weren't for that, he would never have made her go through all that. After that, he tells everyone to eat quickly so they can leave. When they arrive at the location, Ju Hyun notices something strange. The tomb was still there, and since the relic was inside Irene, the structure should have disappeared, but one side was collapsing, and it was also full of soldiers. On one side of the tomb were American Special Operations units, and on the other, Turkish soldiers. Apparently, they had formed an alliance. With a reinforced guard, it was difficult to get in, but Ju Hyun comments that this doesn't mean there isn't another method. Calling himself a tomb raider, Ju Hyun tells Yoo Jae-ha how the raiders do it. They go to a bathroom, and the protagonist is asked why they always end up there. Then Ju Hyun explains that the areas around the tomb are protected by the relic's aura, but there is always a blind spot, so they would open a hole to enter using a relic. Yoo Jae-ha asks if that item was like a C4, but Ju Hyun replies that it wasn't a bomb. It was something he had stolen from the American excavation team, a rank D relic with the function of making the user fart easily. Then the protagonist activates his basic Tomb Raider ability. If he used this ability, he would be able to make a hole in the structure, able to pass through the walls of a tomb that even dynamite couldn't scratch. But they still didn't have enough destructive power, so they would use it as a detonator. He then asks his companions to cover their ears. The relic begins to energize and then explodes, causing a hole in the ground, and Ju Hyun tells his friends that the relic would not damage anything beyond the tomb. That hole would lead them inside the tomb. Inside the tunnel, Yoo Jae-ha says the soldiers were making a lot of noise and asks if they had been discovered. The protagonist in turn responds that there must be a place to hide inside the tomb, but the path was blocked, wondering how many relics he would still have to blow up. The soldiers hear the noises and decide to enter the tomb. As they walk, Yoo Jae-ha says they were really inside the tomb, and the protagonist says the boy doubts him too much. Then he asks them to wait at the location because he would gather information about the place, but Yoo Jae-ha decides to accompany him. As he lights the walls with his torch, engravings appear. Ju Hyun says that this is interesting, because the relic of that tomb is the touch of Midas, so it was very likely that the item inside Irene was this one. Yoo Jae-ha says it doesn't make sense because the girl suffers from bad luck that happens around her, but the protagonist mentions that in the story, Midas' hand was also the hand of misfortune. In Greek mythology, the god of alcohol Dionysus decided to grant King Midas a wish. It was a reward for him having protected his master, and then Midas wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. Dionysus thought that was foolish but granted his wish. However, Midas' blessing did not last long. Everything he touched, even water or food, turned to gold, causing him to starve. Desperate, Midas begged for his life, and Dionysus showed him a way to undo his request. If he bathed in the river Pactolus, he would be able to cleanse the wish from his hands. The protagonist thinks that if there is something that resembles the river, there might be a way to separate the relic from the girl, and then he would get another relic for himself. However, the soldiers appear and soon shoot at the group. Ju Hyun says they are probably able to shoot there because the tomb has already been damaged. Then he asks if the girl is okay, because she was losing her breath and he couldn't let that happen. Then the boy asks them to go on without him because he would just take care of the soldiers first, since running away wasn't his style. General Kim is notified that she had received a request for reinforcements in Turkey. Her subordinate says they couldn't contact the agents, and in the reports, they seemed terrified. According to the report, a group of unarmed people had invaded the tomb. Kim says there was no way they were unarmed and that they must have at least one relic. Then she gets irritated because it was probably those two boys. Ju Hyun attracts the soldiers' attention, and Yoo Jae-ha yells that it didn't matter the relic. There was no way he could defeat them with a knife. Then the men open fire, and the protagonist decides to run away, while thinking that first he would distract them using the relic's aura, and now he would increase his speed using the sword of the Florid Knight. If he did this one by one, they would take the bait and fall into the trap. The soldiers say the young man was cornered, and ask him to put his weapons on the ground. However, a burst of light happens, blinding the men. After this, the boy decides to advance and takes them all down shortly after. Right after, he returns to his friends, saying he had discovered where the river was. They arrive at the river, and the protagonist says it was exactly what the engraving said. Then he asks Irene to bathe in the lake, because King Midas got rid of his ability that way, and maybe she could get rid of her relic too. To reassure the girl, he says there were no traps, and that they would be on the other side. Right after, the young woman takes off her clothes and enters the lake. Ju Hyun says he was watching just as a precaution in case something happened, because the relic could attack her when it leaves her body. And he tells Yoo Jae-ha that you can never let your guard down. While bathing, the girl says it would work. However, suddenly a voice calls the young girl its other half. The protagonist rushes to help her. Panels appear warning that the relic dormant in the lake had awakened. Irritated, the young man says he already understood and tells Irene to get out of there, but she says she can't move her body. Soon after, her body begins to turn into gold. Ju Hyun decides to jump into the water to help her, while thinking about how things ended up like this, because this wasn't a trap and the engraving said the relic was submerged. But he thought the relic was completely attached to Irene's body and wonders if there were more relics. When he reaches the young girl, he tells her not to worry because he is there. The voice tells the boy not to interfere because it was taking its other half back. The Midas relic was split into two pieces, the golden hand and the hand of misfortune. Ju Hyun says that the hand of misfortune got stuck in Irene's body, and that relic was trying to kill her to take its half out of her, so they would have to do the same, and use the power of domination to make that relic submit to the girl. He then asks Irene to do as she had practiced, and says that if they combine their domination powers, it will be easy. The relic begs them to stop because it hurts, but Irene tells the relic to stop resisting and submit to her. Ju Hyun says he is proud of her for learning so well. Irene's body begins to return to normal. Her mark had also changed, and Ju Hyun explains that it was because the contract was now complete. And now that she has the golden hand and the hand of misfortune, the balance is restored. So the disasters that happen around her shouldn't be a problem now. Happy, the young girl hugs the protagonist and thanks him. Meanwhile, General Kim is informed that they couldn't contact any of the agents and that they might all be dead. Another report arrives saying that a tunnel had appeared in the middle of the tomb. The tunnel apparently led to a nearby city. However, the general couldn't be interrupted because she was busy with an urgent matter. On a call, Richard questions why they were talking to a baby. A woman says that the baby was General Kim. That was one of the effects of using Sekhmet's relic, and this information is confidential. The effect is the transformation, as many say that Sekhmet is actually Hathor, the goddess of fertility transformed. Richard asks if that had finished off those kids. The woman in turn says she was there to report about it because it seems they escaped, and little Kim starts crying. The man asks her to calm down because he can't understand anything. The woman says the baby was asking how things were going with Pandora. Smiling, Richard says he got good news. They finally had the opening ceremony of the International Administrative System of Tombs, and from now on, all relics would be under their possession. A new law will establish the prohibition of relic use. Violation of this law will be considered an act of terrorism, and the offender will be severely punished. The group was returning to New York using the Hilton family's private jet. Although they planned to return to Los Angeles, Irene asked the young men to come to her home because her parents wanted to meet them. The girl that said that her family was now free from her bad luck, so the Hilton couple was very happy and decided to invite the person who freed their daughter for dinner. Ju Hyun accepted the invitation since he was thinking of having that family on his side because he would need someone to cover for him. With this, everything was going according to his plan. When they arrived at the airport, Yujaya asks if the boy wasn't going to get ready to disembark. The protagonist in turn says he was sensing some strong relic auras in that place, and that it seems some people were waiting for them. At the airport, the soldiers say they were taking a countermeasure for everyone's safety, and that people with relics should hand them over. One of the people tries to flee, but Pandora's soldiers manage to capture them. A man says his first mission was going well, and asks to punish those who resist to set an example. Shortly after, the colonel is informed that a strong relic has been detected and that they suspected it was an item related to wealth. The man asks to be shown the way. As they walked, Ju Hyun says they didn't mean to be nervous, because they had a trump card, which was Irene, and he asks the girl what she thinks about testing her relic now that it is complete. But the young girl says she has never tested the relic before, and the boy responds by saying it's easy because she just needs to do it like when she dominated the relic, and that he would help her if anything happened. But immediately after, the soldiers surround the group and order them to stay still. The colonel says they knew they had relics. That organization had the mission in the future to hand over all relics to certain people and create a monopoly. But the protagonist remembers that Pandora would only be created a few years from now, and that this was a big difference, and that the future had probably changed again. The man says they would release them as soon as they handed over their relics. Ju Hyun questions what kind of authority they had to demand that they hand over their relics, and tells them to get out of there if they don't want to die. The colonel asks if the young man thought this was a joke, and that maybe if he shot him in the head, he would come back to his senses. Then the protagonist gives the signal to Irene. The man orders his men to shoot at the group, but their guns explode. Ju Hyun says the girl did it right. Right after, he takes her hand and tells her to try harder, and that he would help her if the relic got out of control. The colonel orders all the agents to grab their secondary weapons, because now they would attack using the relics provided by Pandora. The young man questions how they dared to try to fight him. Immediately after, an explosion of energy occurs. The panel warns that the entire airport has been taken over by extraordinary bad luck, and that a great evil aura is torturing the enemy relics. Ju Hyun comments that it seemed to be working well this time. All the agents' relics start to be destroyed, and they start to flee. The protagonist grabs the colonel and tells him to tell Pandora to stop creating these laws and use what they have to do something productive. Immediately after, a big explosion happens. On the news, it is said that the number of dead and injured has not yet been confirmed, but due to the damage, it will be difficult to operate in the region. Experts say that Pandora will not emerge unscathed from this case, and Ju Hyun comments that they were syncing with their own plan, since what attracted the most attention at the airport was Pandora, and they will be the suspects behind the case and will attract criticism. Then he thanks Irene because it was thanks to her that they managed to defeat the agents easily, and asks if the girl was feeling anything wrong with her body, and she replies that she wasn't feeling anything. The protagonist finds it strange because she had used a lot of power, and there was no way the side effects wouldn't appear. Side effects arise after using a relic. In exchange for lending their powers, they torture their masters. And Iron had used a lot of power to blow up the airport, so her relic would definitely demand something in return. Immediately after, Irene's chest begins to glow, and the girl says she can't breathe. The protagonist thinks that the girl's side effect has started and wonders if it is a type of effect that tortures the user's body. Then he puts his hand on the young woman's shoulder and asks her to calm down, because he would try to lessen it with his domination. Shortly after, the girl faints, and Yoo-jae asks why she suddenly became like that. But Iron quickly gets up. Joo-hyun says the girl seemed crazy and asks if she was okay. However, the young girl doesn't answer the question and moves towards the boy, giving the protagonist a hug, leaving him speechless. Joo-hyun says that the side effect must have passed, and quickly, the girl falls asleep. The panel explains that after using the Midas relic, the user will show their greed and feel a strong desire for the things they want. Then Iron wakes up, apologizing and saying she didn't know why she did that. The protagonist says it was the relic making her pay the price for using its powers. Shortly after, they arrive at the Hilton mansion, and Yoo-jae asks if he could stay in the car, because if he met George Hilton, he would kill him. Iron tells the boy not to worry because her brother wasn't home. Joo-hyun asks the young man to get out of the car because they would start visiting the Hilton family frequently, so he should stop hiding. And if they found out, he should beg for forgiveness. But Yoo-jae says they would kill him before doing that. As they get out of the car, Iron says she would show the way, and comments that it had been a while since she returned home because she was afraid her bad luck would affect her family, so she stayed in hotels. But now she didn't need to do that anymore and thanks the protagonist. Joo-hyun in turn says the girl doesn't need to thank him because she helped at the auction. Then Iron notices a blue Ferrari parked nearby, and it was her brother's car. Right after, a gun is pointed at Yoo-jae's head, and George appears, asking if that wasn't the swindler who sold him a fake painting. Iron asks why her brother was at home. The man replies that he received an urgent call from the mansion. Meanwhile, Yoo-jae begs for forgiveness. But George says that if he wanted forgiveness, he should have asked for it earlier, and at this time he would kill him so he couldn't play dead again. Joo-hyun tells George that the boy is too valuable to kill over a scam. He had helped his sister get rid of her curse and asks if there was any way to forgive him, and if they couldn't use this as compensation for being tricked. George says his sister had told him they had helped to lift her curse, but questions how that could be freeing her from the curse since the relic was now fully in her body. Then he points the gun at the protagonist and says he is also a swindler. Joo-hyun says the man knows nothing about relics and acts like he does, and that the relic had been in the girl's body from the beginning, so they only helped her control it, and that the relic would not be removed. George asks if Iron would have to live like this for the rest of her life, and says he will find a specialist to remove the relic from Irene's body. Joo-hyun thinks that the Hilton family is devoted to Catholicism and that they don't like relics. The girl asks her brother to stop acting this way because it was making her sad, and explains that even though the relic had fused with her, she was still the same. George lowers the gun and says he really had crossed the line but warns the girl that the relic was dangerous and that she could die because of it. Joo-hyun asks the man if something had happened, but George replies that it was none of the boy's business. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.